the travelling companion. Poor John was very sad, for his father was so ill he had no hope of his recovery. John sat alone with the sick man in the little room, and the lamp had nearly burned out, for it was late in the night. "You have been a good son, John," said the sick father, "and God will help you on in the world." He looked at him as he spoke, with mild, earnest eyes, drew a deep sigh, and died, yet it appeared as if he still slept. John wept bitterly. He had no one in the wide world now, neither father, mother, brother, nor sister. Poor John! He knelt down by the bed, kissed his dead father's hand, and wept many, many bitter tears. But at last his eyes closed, and he fell asleep with his head resting against the hard bedpost. Then he dreamed a strange dream. He thought he saw the sun shining upon him, and his father alive and well, and even heard him laughing as he used to do when he was very happy. A beautiful girl with a golden crown on her head and long shining hair gave him her hand, and his father said, "See what a bride you have won. She is the loveliest maiden on the whole earth." Then he awoke, and all the beautiful things vanished before his eyes. His father lay dead on the bed, and he was all alone. Poor John! During the following week, the dead man was buried. The son walked behind the coffin which contained his father, whom he so dearly loved and would never again behold. He heard the earth fall on the coffin lid, and watched it till only a corner remained in sight, and at last that also disappeared. He felt as if his heart would break with its weight of sorrow, till those who stood round the grave sang a psalm, and the sweet holy tones brought tears into his eyes, which relieved him. The sun shone brightly down on the green trees, as if it would say, "You must not be so sorrowful, John. Do you see the beautiful blue sky above you? Your father is up there, and he prays to the loving Father of all that you may do well in the future." "I will always be good," said John, "and then I shall go to be with my Father in heaven. What joy it will be when we see each other again! How much I shall have to relate to him, and how many things he will be able to explain to me of the delights of heaven, and teach me as he once did on earth. Oh, what joy it will be!" He pictured it all so plainly to himself that he smiled even while the tears ran down his cheeks. The little birds in the chestnut trees twittered, "Tweet, tweet." They were so happy, although they had seen the funeral, but they seemed as if they knew that the dead man was now in heaven, and that he had wings much larger and more beautiful than their own, and he was happy now because he had been good here on earth, and they were glad of it. John saw them fly away out of the green trees into the wide world, and he longed to fly with them, but first he cut out a large wooden cross to place on his father's grave, and when he brought it there in the evening, he found the grave decked out with gravel and flowers. Strangers had done this, they who had known the good old father, who was now dead, and who had loved him very much. Early the next morning, John packed up his little bundle of clothes, and placed all his money, which consisted of $50 and a few shillings, in his girdle. With this he determined to try his fortune in the world. But first he went into the churchyard, and by his father's grave he offered up a prayer and said, "Farewell." As he passed through the fields, all the flowers looked fresh and beautiful in the warm sunshine, and nodded in the wind, as if they wished to say, "Welcome to the green wood, where all is fresh and bright." Then John turned to have one more look at the old church in which he had been christened in his infancy, and where his father had taken him every Sunday to hear the service and join in singing the psalms. As he looked at the old tower, he espied the ringer standing at one of the narrow openings, with his little pointed red cap on his head, and shading his eyes from the sun with his bent arm. John nodded farewell to him, and the little ringer waved his red cap, laid his hand on his heart, and kissed his hand to him a great many times, to show that he felt kindly towards him, and wished him a prosperous journey. John continued his journey, and thought of all the wonderful things he should see in the large, beautiful world, till he found himself farther away from home than ever he had been before. He did not even know the names of the places he passed through, and could scarcely understand the language of the people he met, for he was far away in a strange land. The first night he slept on a haystack out in the fields, for there was no other bed for him, but it seemed to him so nice and comfortable that even a king need not wish for a better. The field, the brook, the haystack, with the blue sky above, formed a beautiful sleeping room. The green grass, with the little red and white flowers, was the carpet. The elder bushes and the hedges of wild roses looked like garlands on the walls, and for a bath he could have the clear, fresh water of the brook, while the rushes bowed their heads to him to wish him good morning and good evening. The moon, like a large lamp, hung high up in the blue ceiling, and he had no fear of its setting fire to his curtains. John slept here quite safely all night, and when he awoke, the sun was up, and all the little birds were singing round him, "Good morning, good morning. Are you not up yet?" It was Sunday, and the bells were ringing for church. As the people went in, John followed them. He heard God's word, joined in singing the psalms, and listened to the preacher. It seemed to him just as if he were in his own church, where he had been christened and had sung the psalms with his father. Out in the churchyard were several graves, and on some of them the grass had grown very high. John thought of his father's grave, which he knew at last would look like these, as he was not there to weed and attend to it. Then he set to work, pulled up the high grass, raised the wooden crosses which had fallen down, and replaced the wreaths which had been blown away from their places by the wind, thinking all the time, "Perhaps someone is doing the same for my father's grave, as I am not there to do it." Outside the church door stood an old beggar, leaning on his crutch. John gave him his silver shillings, and then he continued his journey, feeling lighter and happier than ever. Towards evening, the weather became very stormy, and he hastened on as quickly as he could to get shelter. But it was quite dark by the time he reached a little lonely church which stood on a hill. "I will go in here," he said, "and sit down in a corner, for I am quite tired and want rest." So he went in and seated himself. Then he folded his hands and offered up his evening prayer, and was soon fast asleep and dreaming, while the thunder rolled and the lightning flashed without. When he awoke, it was still night, but the storm had ceased, and the moon shone in upon him through the windows. Then he saw an open coffin standing in the centre of the church, which contained a dead man, waiting for burial. John was not at all timid. He had a good conscience, and he knew also that the dead can never injure anyone. It is living wicked men who do harm to others. Two such wicked persons stood now by the dead man, who had been brought to the church to be buried. Their evil intentions were to throw the poor dead body outside the church door, and not leave him to rest in his coffin. "Why do you do this?" asked John, when he saw what they were going to do. "It is very wicked. Leave him to rest in peace in Christ's name." "Nonsense," replied the two dreadful men. "He has cheated us. He owed us money which he could not pay, and now he is dead. We shall not get a penny, so we mean to have our revenge, and let him lie like a dog outside the church door." "I have only $50, said John. "It is all I possess in the world, but I will give it to you if you will promise me faithfully to leave the dead man in peace." I shall be able to get on without the money. I have strong and healthy limbs, and God will always help me." "Why, of course," said the horrid men. "If you will pay his debt, we will both promise not to touch him. You may depend upon that." And then they took the money he offered them, laughed at him for his good nature, and went their way. Then he laid the dead body back in the coffin, folded the hands, and took leave of it, and went away contentedly through the great forest. All around him he could see the prettiest little elves dancing in the moonlight which shone through the trees. They were not disturbed by his appearance, for they knew he was good and harmless among men. They are wicked people only who can never obtain a glimpse of fairies. Some of them were not taller than the breadth of a finger, and they wore golden combs in their long yellow hair. They were rocking themselves two together on the large dewdrops with which the leaves and the high grass were sprinkled. Sometimes the dewdrops would roll away, and then they fell down between the stems of the long grass and caused a great deal of laughing and noise among the other little people. It was quite charming to watch them at play. Then they sang songs, and John remembered that he had learnt those pretty songs when he was a little boy. Large speckled spiders, with silver crowns on their heads, were employed to spin suspension bridges and palaces from one hedge to another, and when the tiny drops fell upon them, they glittered in the moonlight like shining glass. This continued till sunrise. Then the little elves crept into the flower buds, and the wind seized the bridges and palaces and fluttered them in the air like cobwebs. As John left the wood, a strong man's voice called after him, "Hallo, comrade, where are you travelling?" "Into the wide world," he replied. "I am only a poor lad. I have neither father nor mother, but God will help me." "I am going into the wide world also," replied the stranger. "Shall we keep each other company?" "With all my heart," he said. And so they went on together. Soon they began to like each other very much, for they were both good. But John found out that the stranger was much more clever than himself. He had travelled all over the world and could describe almost everything. The sun was high in the heavens when they seated themselves under a large tree to eat their breakfast, and at the same moment an old woman came towards them. She was very old and almost bent double. She leaned upon a stick and carried on her back a bundle of firewood which she had collected in the forest. Her apron was tied round it, and John saw 3 great stems of fern and some willow twigs peeping out. Just as she came close up to them, her foot slipped and she fell to the ground, screaming loudly. Poor old woman, she had broken her leg. John proposed directly that they should carry the old woman home to her cottage, but the stranger opened his knapsack and took out a box, in which he said he had a salve that would quickly make her leg well and strong again, so that she would be able to walk home herself, as if her leg had never been broken. And all that he would ask in return was the 3 fern stems which she carried in her apron. "That is rather too high a price," said the old woman, nodding her head quite strangely. She did not seem at all inclined to part with the fern stems. However, it was not very agreeable to lie there with a broken leg, so she gave them to him. And such was the power of the ointment, that no sooner had he rubbed her leg with it than the old mother rose up and walked even better than she had done before. But then this wonderful ointment could not be bought at a chemist's. "What can you want with those 3 fern rods?" asked John of his fellow traveller. "Oh, they will make capital brooms," said he. "And I like them because I have strange whims sometimes." Then they walked on together for a long distance. "How dark the sky is becoming," said John. "And look at those thick, heavy clouds." "Those are not clouds," replied his fellow traveller. "They are mountains, large, lofty mountains, on the tops of which we should be above the clouds, in the pure, free air. Believe me, it is delightful to ascend so high. Tomorrow we shall be there." But the mountains were not so near as they appeared. They had to travel a whole day before they reached them, and pass through black forests and piles of rock as large as a town. The journey had been so fatiguing that John and his fellow traveller stopped to rest at a roadside inn, so that they might gain strength for their journey on the morrow. In the large public room of the inn, a great many persons were assembled to see a comedy performed by dolls. The showman had just erected his little theatre, and the people were sitting round the room to witness the performance. Right in front, in the very best place, sat a stout butcher with a great bulldog by his side, who seemed very much inclined to bite. He sat staring with all his eyes, and so indeed did everyone else in the room. And then the play began. It was a pretty piece, with a king and a queen in it, who sat on a beautiful throne and had gold crowns on their heads. The trains to their dresses were very long, according to the fashion, while the prettiest of wooden dolls, with glass eyes and large moustaches, stood at the doors, and opened and shut them, that the fresh air might come into the room. It was a very pleasant play, not at all mournful, but just as the queen stood up and walked across the stage, the great bulldog, who should have been held back by his master, made a spring forward, and caught the queen in the teeth by the slender wrist, so that it snapped in two. This was a very dreadful disaster. The poor man, who was exhibiting the dolls, was much annoyed and quite sad about his queen. She was the prettiest doll he had, and the bulldog had broken her head and shoulders off. But after all the people were gone away, the stranger, who came with John, said that he could soon set her to rights. And then he brought out his box and rubbed the doll with some of the salve with which he had cured the old woman when she broke her leg. As soon as this was done, the doll's back became quite right again. Her head and shoulders were fixed on, and she could even move her limbs herself. There was now no occasion to pull the wires, for the doll acted just like a living creature, excepting that she could not speak. The man to whom the show belonged was quite delighted at having a doll who could dance of herself without being pulled by the wires. None of the other dolls could do this. During the night, when all the people at the inn were gone to bed, someone was heard to sigh so deeply and painfully, and the sighing continued for so long a time, that everyone got up to see what could be the matter. The showman went at once to his little theatre, and found that it proceeded from the dolls, who all lay on the floor sighing piteously and staring with their glass eyes. They all wanted to be rubbed with the ointment, so that, like the queen, they might be able to move of themselves. The queen threw herself on her knees, took off her beautiful crown, and, holding it in her hand, cried, "Take this from me, but do rub my husband and his courtiers." The poor man who owned the theatre could scarcely refrain from weeping. He was so sorry that he could not help them. Then he immediately spoke to John's comrade, and promised him all the money he might receive at the next evening's performance, if he would only rub the ointment on 4 or 5 of his dolls. But the fellow traveller said he did not require anything in return, excepting the sword which the showman wore by his side. As soon as he received the sword, he anointed 6 of the dolls with the ointment, and they were able immediately to dance so gracefully that all the living girls in the room could not help joining in the dance. The coachman danced with the cook, and the waiters with the chambermaids, and all the strangers joined. Even the tongs and the fire shovel made an attempt, but they fell down after the first jump. So, after all, it was a very merry night. The next morning, John and his companion left the inn to continue their journey through the great pine forests and over the high mountains. They arrived at last at such a great height that towns and villages lay beneath them, and the church steeples looked like little specks between the green trees. They could see for miles round, far away, to places they had never visited, and John saw more of the beautiful world than he had ever known before. The sun shone brightly in the blue firmament above, and through the clear mountain air came the sound of the huntsman's horn, and the soft, sweet notes brought tears into his eyes, and he could not help exclaiming, "How good and loving God is to give us all this beauty and loveliness in the world to make us happy." His fellow traveller stood by with folded hands, gazing on the dark wood and the towns bathed in the warm sunshine. At this moment there sounded over their heads sweet music. They looked up and discovered a large white swan hovering in the air and singing as never bird sang before. But the song soon became weaker and weaker. The bird's head drooped, and he sunk slowly down and lay dead at their feet. "It is a beautiful bird," said the traveller, "and these large white wings are worth a great deal of money. I will take them with me. You see now that a sword will be very useful." So he cut off the wings of the dead swan with one blow, and carried them away with him. They now continued their journey over the mountains for many miles, till they at length reached a large city containing hundreds of towers that shone in the sunshine like silver. In the midst of the city stood a splendid marble palace, roofed with pure red gold, in which dwelt the king. John and his companion would not go into the town immediately, so they stopped at an inn outside the town to change their clothes, for they wished to appear respectable as they walked through the streets. The landlord told them that the king was a very good man, who never injured anyone, but as to his daughter, heaven defend us! She was indeed a wicked princess. She possessed beauty enough. Nobody could be more elegant or prettier than she was. But what of that? For she was a wicked witch, and in consequence of her conduct, many noble young princes had lost their lives. Anyone was at liberty to make her an offer, were he a prince or a beggar. It mattered not to her. She would ask him to guess 3 things which she had just thought of, and if he succeed, he was to marry her, and be king over all the land when her father died. But if he could not guess these 3 things, then she ordered him to be hanged or to have his head cut off. The old king, her father, was very much grieved at her conduct, but he could not prevent her from being so wicked, because he once said he would have nothing more to do with her lovers. She might do as she pleased. Each prince who came and tried the 3 guesses so that he might marry the princess had been unable to find them out and had been hanged or beheaded. They had all been warned in time and might have left her alone if they would. The old king became at last so distressed at all these dreadful circumstances that for a whole day every year he and his soldiers knelt and prayed that the princess might become good. But she continued as wicked as ever. The old women who drank brandy would colour it quite black before they drank it, to show how they mourned, and what more could they do? "What a horrible princess," said John. "She ought to be well flogged. If I were the old king, I would have her punished in some way." Just then they heard the people outside shouting, "Hurrah!" and, looking out, they saw the princess passing by, and she was really so beautiful that everybody forgot her wickedness and shouted, "Hurrah!" 12 lovely maidens in white silk dresses, holding golden tulips in their hands, rode by her side on coal-black horses. The princess herself had a snow-white steed, decked with diamonds and rubies. Her dress was of cloth of gold, and the whip she held in her hand looked like a sunbeam. The golden crown on her head glittered like the stars of heaven, and her mantle was formed of thousands of butterflies' wings sewn together. Yet she herself was more beautiful than all. When John saw her, his face became as red as a drop of blood, and he could scarcely utter a word. The princess looked exactly like the beautiful lady with the golden crown, of whom he had dreamed on the night his father died. She appeared to him so lovely that he could not help loving her. It could not be true, he thought, that she was really a wicked witch who ordered people to be hanged or beheaded if they could not guess her thoughts. Everyone has permission to go and ask her hand, even the poorest beggar. I shall pay a visit to the palace, he said. I must go, for I cannot help myself. Then they all advised him not to attempt it, for he would be sure to share the same fate as the rest. His fellow traveller also tried to persuade him against it, but John seemed quite sure of success. He brushed his shoes and his coat, washed his face and his hands, combed his soft flaxen hair, and then went out alone into the town and walked to the palace. "Come in," said the king, as John knocked at the door. John opened it, and the old king, in a dressing gown and embroidered slippers, came toward him. He had the crown on his head, carried his sceptre in one hand and the orb in the other. "Wait a bit," said he, and he placed the orb under his arm, so that he could offer the other hand to John. But when he found that John was another suitor, he began to weep so violently that both the sceptre and the orb fell to the floor, and he was obliged to wipe his eyes with his dressing gown. Poor old king! "Let her alone," he said. "You will fare as badly as all the others. Come, I will show you." Then he led him out into the princess's pleasure gardens, and there he saw a frightful sight. On every tree hung 3 or 4 kings' sons who had wooed the princess, but had not been able to guess the riddles she gave them. Their skeletons rattled in every breeze, so that the terrified birds never dared to venture into the garden. All the flowers were supported by human bones instead of sticks, and human skulls in the flower pots grinned horribly. It was really a doleful garden for a princess. "Do you see all this?" said the old king. "Your fate will be the same as those who are here. Therefore do not attempt it. You really make me very unhappy. I take these things to heart so very much." John kissed the good old king's hand, and said he was sure it would be all right, for he was quite enchanted with the beautiful princess. Then the princess herself came riding into the palace yard with all her ladies, and he wished her good morning. She looked wonderfully fair and lovely when she offered her hand to John, and he loved her more than ever. How could she be a wicked witch, as all the people asserted? He accompanied her into the hall, and the little pages offered them gingerbread nuts and sweetmeats. But the old king was so unhappy he could eat nothing, and besides, gingerbread nuts were too hard for him. It was decided that John should come to the palace the next day, when the judges and the whole of the councillors would be present, to try if he could guess the first riddle. If he succeeded, he would have to come a second time, but if not, he would lose his life, and no one had ever been able to guess even one. However, John was not at all anxious about the result of his trial. On the contrary, he was very merry. He thought only of the beautiful princess, and believed that in some way he should have help, but how he knew not, and did not like to think about it, so he danced along the high road as he went back to the inn, where he had left his fellow traveller waiting for him. John could not refrain from telling him how gracious the princess had been, and how beautiful she looked. He longed for the next day so much that he might go to the palace and try his luck at guessing the riddles. But his comrade shook his head and looked very mournful. "I do so wish you to do well," said he. "We might have continued together much longer, and now I am likely to lose you, you poor dear John. I could shed tears, but I will not make you unhappy on the last night we may be together. We will be merry, really merry this evening. Tomorrow, after you are gone, shall be able to weep undisturbed." It was very quickly known among the inhabitants of the town that another suitor had arrived for the princess, and there was great sorrow in consequence. The theatre remained closed. The women who sold sweetmeats tied crape round the sugar sticks, and the king and the priests were on their knees in the church. There was a great lamentation, for no one expected John to succeed better than those who had been suitors before. In the evening, John's comrade prepared a large bowl of punch, and said, "Now let us be merry, and drink to the health of the princess." But after drinking 2 glasses, John became so sleepy that he could not keep his eyes open, and fell fast asleep. Then his fellow traveller lifted him gently out of his chair and laid him on the bed, and as soon as it was quite dark, he took the 2 large wings which he had cut from the dead swan, and tied them firmly to his own shoulders. Then he put into his pocket the largest of the 3 rods which he had obtained from the old woman who had fallen and broken her leg. After this he opened the window and flew away over the town, straight towards the palace, and seated himself in a corner, under the window which looked into the bedroom of the princess. The town was perfectly still when the clock struck 11:45. Presently the window opened, and the princess, who had large black wings to her shoulders and a long white mantle, flew away over the city towards a high mountain. The fellow traveller, who had made himself invisible so that she could not possibly see him, flew after her through the air and whipped the princess with his rod, so that the blood came whenever he struck her. Ah! It was a strange flight through the air. The wind caught her mantle so that it spread out on all sides like the large sail of a ship, and the moon shone through it. "How it hails, to be sure!" said the princess, at each blow she received from the rod, and it served her right to be whipped. At last she reached the side of the mountain and knocked. The mountain opened with a noise like the roll of thunder, and the princess went in. The traveller followed her. No one could see him, as he had made himself invisible. They went through a long, wide passage. 1,000 gleaming spiders ran here and there on the walls, causing them to glitter as if they were illuminated with fire. They next entered a large hall built of silver and gold. Large red and blue flowers shone on the walls, looking like sunflowers in size, but no one could dare to pluck them, for the stems were hideous poisonous snakes, and the flowers were flames of fire darting out of their jaws. Shining glow-worms covered the ceiling, and sky-blue bats flapped their transparent wings. Altogether, the place had a frightful appearance. In the middle of the floor stood a throne supported by 4 skeleton horses, whose harness had been made by fiery red spiders. The throne itself was made of milk-white glass, and the cushions were little black mice, each biting the other's tail. Over it hung a canopy of rose-coloured spiders' webs, spotted with the prettiest little green flies, which sparkled like precious stones. On the throne sat an old magician with a crown on his ugly head and a sceptre in his hand. He kissed the princess on the forehead, seated her by his side on the splendid throne, and then the music commenced. Great black grasshoppers played the mouth organ, and the owl struck herself on the body instead of a drum. It was altogether a ridiculous concert. Little black goblins with false lights in their caps danced about the hall, but no one could see the traveller, and he had placed himself just behind the throne, where he could see and hear everything. The courtiers who came in afterwards looked noble and grand, but anyone with common sense could see what they really were, only broomsticks with cabbages for heads. The magician had given them life and dressed them in embroidered robes. It answered very well, as they were only wanted for show. After there had been a little dancing, the princess told the magician that she had a new suitor, and asked him what she could think of for the suitor to guess when he came to the castle the next morning. "Listen to what I say," said the magician. "You must choose something very easy. He is less likely to guess it then. Think of one of your shoes. He will never imagine it is that. Then cut his head off. And mind you, do not forget to bring his eyes with you tomorrow night, that I may eat them." The princess curtsied low and said she would not forget the eyes. The magician then opened the mountain, and she flew home again. But the traveller followed and flogged her so much with the rod that she sighed quite deeply about the heavy hailstorm, and made as much haste as she could to get back to her bedroom through the window. The traveller then returned to the inn where John still slept, took off his wings, and lay down on the bed, for he was very tired. Early in the morning John awoke, and when his fellow traveller got up, he said that he had a very wonderful dream about the princess and her shoe. He therefore advised John to ask her if she had not thought of her shoe. Of course the traveller knew this from what the magician in the mountain had said. "I may as well say that as anything," said John. "Perhaps your dream may come true. Still I will say farewell, for if I guess wrong, I shall never see you again." Then they embraced each other, and John went into the town and walked to the palace. The great hall was full of people, and the judges sat in armchairs with eider-down cushions to rest their heads upon, because they had so much to think of. The old king stood near, wiping his eyes with his white pocket handkerchief. When the princess entered, she looked even more beautiful than she had appeared the day before, and greeted everyone present most gracefully. But to John she gave her hand and said, "Good morning to you." Now came the time for John to guess what she was thinking of, and oh, how kindly she looked at him as she spoke. But when he uttered the single word, "shoe," she turned as pale as a ghost. All her wisdom could not help her, for he had guessed rightly. Oh, how pleased the old king was! It was quite amusing to see how he capered about. All the people clapped their hands, both on his account and John's, who had guessed rightly the first time. His fellow traveller was glad also when he heard how successful John had been. But John folded his hands and thanked God, who, he felt quite sure, would help him again. And he knew he had to guess twice more. The evening passed pleasantly, like the one preceding. While John slept, his companion flew behind the princess to the mountain, and flogged her even harder than before. This time he had taken 2 rods with him. No one saw him go in with her, and he heard all that was said. The princess this time was to think of a glove, and he told John as if he had again heard it in a dream. The next day, therefore, he was able to guess correctly the second time, and it caused great rejoicing at the palace. The whole court jumped about as they had seen the king do the day before, but the princess lay on the sofa and would not say a single word. All now depended upon John. If he only guessed rightly the third time, he would marry the princess, and reign over the kingdom after the death of the old king. But if he failed, he would lose his life, and the magician would have his beautiful blue eyes. That evening John said his prayers and went to bed very early, and soon fell asleep calmly. But his companion tied on his wings to his shoulders, took 3 rods, and, with his sword at his side, flew to the palace. It was a very dark night, and so stormy that the tiles flew from the roofs of the houses, and the trees in the garden upon which the skeletons hung bent themselves like reeds before the wind. The lightning flashed, and the thunder rolled in one long continued peal all night. The window of the castle opened, and the princess flew out. She was pale as death, but she laughed at the storm as if it were not bad enough. Her white mantle fluttered in the wind like a large sail, and the traveller flogged her with the 3 rods till the blood trickled down, and at last she could scarcely fly. She contrived, however, to reach the mountain. "What a hailstorm!" she said as she entered. "I have never been out in such weather as this." "Yes," "There may be too much of a good thing sometimes," said the magician. Then the princess told him that John had guessed rightly the second time, and if he succeeded the next morning, he would win, and she could never come to the mountain again, or practice magic as she had done, and therefore she was quite unhappy. "I will find out something for you to think of which he will never guess, unless he is a greater conjurer than myself. But now let us be merry." Then he took the princess by both hands, and they danced with all the little goblins and jack-o'-lanterns in the room. The red spiders sprang here and there on the walls quite as merrily, and the flowers of fire appeared as if they were throwing out sparks. The owl beat the drum, the crickets whistled, and the grasshoppers played the mouth-organ. It was a very ridiculous ball. After they had danced enough, the princess was obliged to go home, for fear she should be missed at the palace. The magician offered to go with her, that they might be company to each other on the way. Then they flew away through the bad weather, and the traveller followed them, and broke his 3 rods across their shoulders. The magician had never been out in such a hailstorm as this. Just by the palace, the magician stopped to wish the princess farewell, and to whisper in her ear, "Tomorrow, think of my head." But the traveller heard it, and just as the princess slipped through the window into her bedroom, and the magician turned round to fly back to the mountain, he seized him by the long black beard, and with his sabre cut off the wicked conjurer's head just behind the shoulders, so that he could not even see who it was. He threw the body into the sea to the fishes, and after dipping the head into the water, he tied it up in a silk handkerchief, took it with him to the inn, and then went to bed. The next morning he gave John the handkerchief, and told him not to untie it till the princess asked him what she was thinking of. There were so many people in the great hall of the palace that they stood as thick as radishes tied together in a bundle. The council sat in their armchairs with the white cushions. The old king wore new robes, and the golden crown and sceptre had been polished up so that he looked quite smart. But the princess was very pale and wore a black dress as if she were going to a funeral. "What have I thought of?" asked the princess of John. He immediately untied the handkerchief, and was himself quite frightened when he saw the head of the ugly magician. Everyone shuddered, for it was terrible to look at, but the princess sat like a statue and could not utter a single word. At length she rose and gave John her hand, for he had guessed rightly. She looked at no one, but sighed deeply and said, "You are my master now. This evening our marriage must take place." "I am very pleased to hear it," said the old king. "It is just what I wish." Then all the people shouted, "Hurrah!" The band played music in the streets, the bells rang, and the cake women took the black crape off the sugar sticks. There was universal joy. 3 oxen, stuffed with ducks and chickens, were roasted whole in the marketplace, where everyone might help himself to a slice. The fountains spouted forth the most delicious wine, and whoever bought a penny loaf at the baker's received 6 large buns, full of raisins, as a present. In the evening, the whole town was illuminated. The soldiers fired off cannons, and the boys let off crackers. There was eating and drinking, dancing and jumping everywhere. In the palace, the high-born gentlemen and beautiful ladies danced with each other, and they could be heard at a great distance singing the following song. "Here are maidens, young and fair, dancing in the summer air. Like 2 spinning wheels at play, pretty maidens dance away. Dance the spring and summer through, till the sole falls from your shoe." But the princess was still a witch, and she could not love John. His fellow traveller had thought of that, so he gave John 3 feathers out of the swan's wings, and a little bottle with a few drops in it. He told him to place a large bath full of water by the princess's bed, and put the feathers and the drops into it. Then, at the moment, She was about to get into bed. He must give her a little push so that she might fall into the water, and then dip her 3 times. This would destroy the power of the magician, and she would love him very much. John did all that his companion told him to do. The princess shrieked aloud when he dipped her under the water the first time, and struggled under his hands in the form of a great black swan with fiery eyes. As she rose the second time from the water, the swan had become white, with a black ring round its neck. John allowed the water to close once more over the bird, and at the same time it changed into a most beautiful princess. She was more lovely even than before, and thanked him, while her eyes sparkled with tears, for having broken the spell of the magician. The next day, the king came with the whole court to offer their congratulations, and stayed till quite late. Last of all came the travelling companion. He had his staff in his hand and his knapsack on his back. John kissed him many times and told him he must not go. He must remain with him, for he was the cause of all his good fortune. But the traveller shook his head and said gently and kindly, "No, my time is up now. I have only paid my debt to you." Do you remember the dead man whom the bad people wished to throw out of his coffin? You gave all you possessed that he might rest in his grave. I am that man. As he said this, he vanished. The wedding festivities lasted a whole month. John and his princess loved each other dearly, and the old king lived to see many a happy day when he took their little children on his knees and let them play with his scepter, and John became king over the whole country, the Ugly Duckling. It was lovely summer weather in the country, and the golden corn, the green oats, and the haystacks piled up in the meadows looked beautiful. The stork, walking about on his long red legs, chattered in the Egyptian language, which he had learnt from his mother. The cornfields and meadows were surrounded by large forests, in the midst of which were deep pools. It was indeed delightful to walk about in the country. In a sunny spot stood a pleasant old farmhouse close by a deep river, and from the house down to the waterside grew great burdock leaves, so high that under the tallest of them a little child could stand upright. The spot was as wild as the centre of a thick wood. In this snug retreat sat a duck on her nest, watching for her young brood to hatch. She was beginning to get tired of her task, for the little ones were a long time coming out of their shells, and she seldom had any visitors. The other ducks liked much better to swim about in the river than to climb the slippery banks and sit under a burdock leaf to have a gossip with her. At length one shell cracked, and then another, and from each egg came a living creature that lifted its head and cried, "Peep, peep, quack, quack," said the mother. And then they all quacked as well as they could, and looked about them on every side at the large green leaves. Their mother allowed them to look as much as they liked, because green is good for the eyes. "How large the world is," said the young ducks, when they found how much more room they now had than while they were inside the eggshell. "Do you imagine this is the whole world?" asked the mother. "Wait till you have seen the garden. It stretches far beyond that to the parson's field, but I have never ventured to such a distance." "Are you all out?" she continued, rising. "No, I declare. The largest egg lies there still. I wonder how long this is to last. I am quite tired of it." And she seated herself again on the nest. "Well, how are you getting on?" asked an old duck who paid her a visit. "One egg is not hatched yet," said the duck. "It will not break." "But just look at all the others. Are they not the prettiest little ducklings you ever saw? They are the image of their father, who is so unkind. He never comes to see." "Let me see the egg that will not break," said the duck. "I have no doubt it is a turkey's egg. I was persuaded to hatch some once, and after all my care and trouble with the young ones, they were afraid of the water. I quacked and clucked, but all to no purpose. I could not get them to venture in. Let me look at the egg. Yes, that is a turkey's egg. Take my advice. Leave it where it is, and teach the other children to swim. I think I will sit on it a little while longer, said the duck. As I have sat so long already, a few days will be nothing. Please yourself, said the old duck, and she went away. At last the large egg broke, and a young one crept forth, crying, "Peep, peep." It was very large and ugly. The duck stared at it and exclaimed, "It is very large and not at all like the others. I wonder if it really is a turkey. We shall soon find it out, however, when we go to the water. It must go in, if I have to push it myself." On the next day, the weather was delightful, and the sun shone brightly on the green burdock leaves. So the mother duck took her young brood down to the water and jumped in with a splash. "Quack, quack!" cried she, and one after another the little ducklings jumped in. The water closed over their heads, but they came up again in an instant and swam about quite prettily with their legs paddling under them as easily as possible. And the ugly duckling was also in the water swimming with them. "Oh," said the mother, "that is not a turkey. How well he uses his legs, and how upright he holds himself. He is my own child, and he is not so very ugly after all if you look at him properly. Quack, quack, come with me now. I will take you into grand society and introduce you to the farmyard. But you must keep close to me, or you may be trodden upon. And, above all, beware of the cat." When they reached the farmyard, there was a great disturbance. 2 families were fighting for an eel's head, which, after all, was carried off by the cat. "See, children, that is the way of the world," said the mother duck, wetting her beak, for she would have liked the eel's head herself. "Come now, use your legs, and let me see how well you can behave. You must bow your heads prettily to that old duck yonder. She is the highest born of them all, and has Spanish blood. Therefore, she is well off. Don't you see she has a red flag tied to her leg, which is something very grand and a great honor for a duck? It shows that everyone is anxious not to lose her, as she can be recognized both by man and beast. Come now, don't turn your toes. A well-bred duckling spreads his feet wide apart, just like his father and mother. In this way, now bend your neck and say, 'Quack.'" The ducklings did as they were bid, but the other ducks stared and said, "Look, here comes another brood, as if there were not enough of us already. And what a queer-looking object one of them is. We don't want him here." And then one flew out and bit him in the neck. "Let him alone," said the mother. "He is not doing any harm." "Yes, but he is so big and ugly," said the spiteful duck, "and therefore he must be turned out." "The others are very pretty children," said the old duck, with the rag on her leg, "all but that one. I wish his mother could improve him a little." "That is impossible, your grace," replied the mother. "He is not pretty, but he has a very good disposition, and swims as well or even better than the others. I think he will grow up pretty, and perhaps be smaller. He has remained too long in the egg, and therefore his figure is not properly formed." And then she stroked his neck and smoothed the feathers, saying, "It is a drake, and therefore not of so much consequence. I think he will grow up strong and able to take care of himself." "The other ducklings are graceful enough," said the old duck. "Now make yourself at home, and if you can find an eel's head, you can bring it to me." And so they made themselves comfortable. But the poor duckling, who had crept out of his shell last of all and looked so ugly, was bitten and pushed and made fun of, not only by the ducks but by all the poultry. "He is too big," they all said. And the turkey-cock, who had been born into the world with spurs and fancied himself really an emperor, puffed himself out like a vessel in full sail and flew at the duckling, and became quite red in the head with passion, so that the poor little thing did not know where to go, and was quite miserable because he was so ugly, and laughed at by the whole farmyard. So it went on from day to day, till it got worse and worse. The poor duckling was driven about by everyone. Even his brothers and sisters were unkind to him, and would say, "Ah, you ugly creature, I wish the cat would get you." And his mother said she wished he had never been born. The ducks pecked him, the chickens beat him, and the girl who fed the poultry kicked him with her feet. So at last he ran away, frightening the little birds in the hedge as he flew over the palings. "They are afraid of me because I am ugly," he said. So he closed his eyes and flew still farther, until he came out on a large moor inhabited by wild ducks. Here he remained the whole night, feeling very tired and sorrowful. In the morning, when the wild ducks rose in the air, they stared at their new comrade. "What sort of a duck are you?" they all said, coming round him. He bowed to them, and was as polite as he could be, but he did not reply to their question. "You are exceedingly ugly," said the wild ducks, "but that will not matter if you do not want to marry one of our family." Poor thing! He had no thoughts of marriage. All he wanted was permission to lie among the rushes and drink some of the water on the moor. After he had been on the moor 2 days, there came 2 wild geese, or rather goslings, for they had not been out of the egg long and were very saucy. "Listen, friend," said one of them to the duckling, "you are so ugly that we like you very well. Will you go with us and become a bird of passage? Not far from here is another moor, in which there are some pretty wild geese, all unmarried. It is a chance for you to get a wife. You may be lucky, ugly as you are." Pop, pop, sounded in the air, and the 2 wild geese fell dead among the rushes, and the water was tinged with blood. Pop, pop, echoed far and wide in the distance, and whole flocks of wild geese rose up from the rushes. The sound continued from every direction, for the sportsmen surrounded the moor, and some were even seated on branches of trees, overlooking the rushes. The blue smoke from the guns rose like clouds over the dark trees, and as it floated away across the water, a number of sporting dogs bounded in among the rushes, which bent beneath them wherever they went. How they terrified the poor duckling! He turned away his head to hide it under his wing, and at the same moment a large, terrible dog passed quite near him. His jaws were open, his tongue hung from his mouth, and his eyes glared fearfully. He thrust his nose close to the duckling, showing his sharp teeth, and then, splash, splash, he went into the water without touching him. "Oh," sighed the duckling, "how thankful I am for being so ugly. Even a dog will not bite me." And so he lay quite still, while the shot rattled through the rushes, and gun after gun was fired over him. It was late in the day before all became quiet, but even then the poor young thing did not dare to move. He waited quietly for several hours, and then, after looking carefully around him, hastened away from the moor as fast as he could. He ran over field and meadow till a storm arose, and he could hardly struggle against it. Towards evening, he reached a poor little cottage that seemed ready to fall, and only remained standing because he could not decide on which side to fall first. The storm continued so violent that the duckling could go no farther. He sat down by the cottage, and then he noticed that the door was not quite closed in consequence of one of the hinges having given way. There was therefore a narrow opening near the bottom, large enough for him to slip through, which he did very quietly, and got a shelter for the night. A woman, a tomcat, and a hen lived in this cottage. The tomcat, whom the mistress called "my little son," was a great favourite. He could raise his back and purr, and could even throw out sparks from his fur if it were stroked the wrong way. The hen had very short legs, so she was called Chickie Short Legs. She laid good eggs, and her mistress loved her as if she had been her own child. In the morning, the strange visitor was discovered, and the tomcat began to purr, and the hen to cluck. "What is that noise about?" said the old woman, looking round the room, but her sight was not very good. Therefore, when she saw the duckling, she thought it must be a fat duck that had strayed from home. "Oh, what a prize!" she exclaimed. "I hope it is not a drake, for then I shall have some duck's eggs. I must wait and see." So the duckling was allowed to remain on trial for 3 weeks, but there were no eggs. Now the tomcat was the master of the house, and the hen was mistress, and they always said, "We and the world," for they believed themselves to be half the world, and the better half too. The duckling thought that others might hold a different opinion on the subject, but the hen would not listen to such doubts. "Can you lay eggs?" she asked. "No." "Then have the goodness to hold your tongue. Can you raise your back or purr or throw out sparks?" said the tomcat. "No." "Then you have no right to express an opinion when sensible people are speaking." So the duckling sat in a corner, feeling very low-spirited, till the sunshine and the fresh air came into the room through the open door, and then he began to feel such a great longing for a swim on the water that he could not help telling the hen. "What an absurd idea," said the hen. "You have nothing else to do, therefore you have foolish fancies. If you could purr or lay eggs, they would pass away." "But it is so delightful to swim about on the water," said the duckling, "and so refreshing to feel it close over your head while you dive down to the bottom." "Delightful indeed," said the hen. "Why, you must be crazy. Ask the cat. He is the cleverest animal I know. Ask him how he would like to swim about on the water or to dive under it. For I will not speak of my own opinion. Ask our mistress, the old woman. There is no one in the world more clever than she is. Do you think she would like to swim, or to let the water close over her head?" "You don't understand me," said the duckling. "We don't understand you." "Who can understand you?" "I wonder. Do you consider yourself more clever than the cat or the old woman? I will say nothing of myself. Don't imagine such nonsense, child, and thank your good fortune that you have been received here. Are you not in a warm room, and in society from which you may learn something? But you are a chatterer, and your company is not very agreeable. Believe me, I speak only for your own good. I may tell you unpleasant truths, but that is a proof of my friendship. I advise you, therefore, to lay eggs and learn to purr as quickly as possible." "I believe I must go out into the world again," said the duckling. "Yes, do," said the hen. So the duckling left the cottage and soon found water on which it could swim and dive, but was avoided by all other animals because of its ugly appearance. Autumn came, and the leaves in the forest turned to orange and gold. Then, as winter approached, the wind caught them as they fell and whirled them in the cold air. The clouds, heavy with hail and snowflakes, hung low in the sky, and the raven stood on the ferns crying, "Croak, croak." It made one shiver with cold to look at him. All this was very sad for the poor little duckling. One evening, just as the sun set amid radiant clouds, there came a large flock of beautiful birds out of the bushes. The duckling had never seen any like them before. They were swans, and they curved their graceful necks, while their soft plumage shone with dazzling whiteness. They uttered a singular cry as they spread their glorious wings and flew away from those cold regions to warmer countries across the sea. As they mounted higher and higher in the air, the ugly little duckling felt quite a strange sensation as he watched them. He whirled himself in the water like a wheel, stretched out his neck towards them, and uttered a cry so strange that it frightened himself. Could he ever forget those beautiful, happy birds? And when at last they were out of his sight, he dived under the water and rose again almost beside himself with excitement. He knew not the names of these birds, nor where they had flown, but he felt towards them as he had never felt for any other bird in the world. He was not envious of these beautiful creatures, but wished to be as lovely as they. Poor ugly creature! How gladly he would have lived even with the ducks, had they only given him encouragement. The winter grew colder and colder. He was obliged to swill about on the water to keep it from freezing. But every night the space on which he swam became smaller and smaller. At length it froze so hard that the ice in the water crackled as he moved, and the duckling had to paddle with his legs as well as he could to keep the space from closing up. He became exhausted at last and lay still and helpless, frozen fast in the ice. Early in the morning, a peasant who was passing by saw what had happened. He broke the ice in pieces with his wooden shoe and carried the duckling home to his wife. The warmth revived the poor little creature, but when the children wanted to play with him, the duckling thought they would do him some harm. So he started up in terror, fluttered into the milk pan, and splashed the milk about the room. Then the woman clapped her hands, which frightened him still more. He flew first into the butter cask, then into the meal tub, and out again. What a condition he was in! The woman screamed and struck at him with the tongs. The children laughed and screamed and tumbled over each other in their efforts to catch him. But luckily he escaped. The door stood open. The poor creature could just manage to slip out among the bushes and lie down quite exhausted in the newly fallen snow. It would be very sad were I to relate all the misery and privations which the poor little duckling endured during the hard winter, but when it had passed, he found himself lying one morning in a moor, amongst the rushes. He felt the warm sun shining, and heard the larks singing, and saw that all around was beautiful spring. Then the young bird felt that his wings were strong as he flapped them against his sides and rose high into the air. They bore him onwards until he found himself in a large garden before he well knew how it had happened. The apple trees were in full blossom, and the fragrant elders bent their long green branches down to the stream which wound round a smooth lawn. Everything looked beautiful in the freshness of early spring. From a thicket close by came 3 beautiful white swans, rustling their feathers and swimming lightly over the smooth water. The duckling remembered the lovely birds, and felt more strangely unhappy than ever. "I will fly to those royal birds," he exclaimed, "and they will kill me, because I am so ugly and dare to approach them. But it does not matter. Better be killed by them than pecked by the ducks, beaten by the hens, pushed about by the maiden who feeds the poultry, or starved with hunger in the winter." Then he flew to the water and swam towards the beautiful swans. The moment they espied the stranger, they rushed to meet him with outstretched wings. "Kill me!" said the poor bird, and he bent his head down to the surface of the water and awaited death. But what did he see in the clear stream below? His own image, no longer a dark grey bird, ugly and disagreeable to look at, but a graceful and beautiful swan. To be born in a duck's nest in a farmyard is of no consequence to a bird, if it is hatched from a swan's egg. He now felt glad at having suffered sorrow and trouble, because it enabled him to enjoy so much better all the pleasure and happiness around him. For the great swans swam round the newcomer and stroked his neck with their beaks as a welcome. Into the garden presently came some little children, and threw bread and cake into the water. "See," cried the youngest, "there is a new one." And the rest were delighted, and ran to their father and mother, dancing and clapping their hands and shouting joyously, "There is another swan! Come, a new one has arrived!" Then they threw more bread and cake into the water and said, "The new one is the most beautiful of all. He is so young and pretty." And the old swans bowed their heads before him. Then he felt quite ashamed and hid his head under his wing, for he did not know what to do. He was so happy, and yet not at all proud. He had been persecuted and despised for his ugliness, and now he heard them say he was the most beautiful of all the birds. Even the elder tree bent down its boughs into the water before him, and the sun shone warm and bright. Then he rustled his feathers, curved his slender neck, and cried joyfully from the depths of his heart, "I never dreamed of such happiness as this while I was an ugly duckling." The Wicked Prince. There lived once upon a time a wicked prince whose heart and mind were set upon conquering all the countries of the world and on frightening the people. He devastated their countries with fire and sword, and his soldiers trod down the crops in the fields and destroyed the peasants' huts by fire, so that the flames licked the green leaves off the branches and the fruit hung dried up on the singed black trees. Many a poor mother fled, her naked baby in her arms, behind the still smoking walls of her cottage, but also there the soldiers followed her, and when they found her, she served as new nourishment to their diabolical enjoyments. Demons could not possibly have done worse things than these soldiers. The prince was of opinion that all this was right, and that it was only the natural course which things ought to take. His power increased day by day, his name was feared by all, and fortune favoured his deeds. He brought enormous wealth home from the conquered towns, and gradually accumulated in his residence riches which could nowhere be equalled. He erected magnificent palaces, churches, and halls, and all who saw these splendid buildings and great treasures exclaimed admiringly, "What a mighty prince!" But they did not know what endless misery he had brought upon other countries, nor did they hear the sighs and lamentations which rose up from the debris of the destroyed cities. The prince often looked with delight upon his gold and his magnificent edifices, and thought, like the crowd, "What a mighty prince! But I must have more, much more. No power on earth must equal mine, far less exceed it." He made war with all his neighbours and defeated them. The conquered kings were chained up with golden fetters to his chariot when he drove through the streets of his city. These kings had to kneel at his and his courtiers' feet when they sat at table, and live on the morsels which they left. At last the prince had his own statue erected on the public places and fixed on the royal palaces. Nay, he even wished it to be placed in the churches, on the altars. But in this the priests opposed him, saying, "Prince, you are mighty indeed, but God's power is much greater than yours. We dare not obey your orders." "Well," said the prince, "then I will conquer God too." And in his haughtiness and foolish presumption, he ordered a magnificent ship to be constructed, with which he could sail through the air. It was gorgeously fitted out, and of many colours, like the tail of a peacock. It was covered with thousands of eyes, but each eye was the barrel of a gun. The prince sat in the centre of the ship, and had only to touch a spring in order to make thousands of bullets fly out in all directions, while the guns were at once loaded again. Hundreds of eagles were attached to this ship, and it rose with the swiftness of an arrow up towards the sun. The earth was soon left far below, and looked, with its mountains and woods, like a cornfield where the plough had made furrows which separated green meadows. Soon it looked only like a map with indistinct lines upon it, and at last it entirely disappeared in mist and clouds. Higher and higher rose the eagles up into the air. Then God sent one of his numberless angels against the ship. The wicked prince showered thousands of bullets upon him, but they rebounded from his shining wings and fell down like ordinary hailstones. One drop of blood, one single drop, came out of the white feathers of the angel's wings and fell upon the ship in which the prince sat, burnt into it, and weighed upon it like thousands of hundredweights. Dragging it rapidly down to the earth again, the strong wings of the eagles gave way. The wind roared round the prince's head, and the clouds around, were they formed by the smoke rising up from the burnt cities, took strange shapes like crabs, many, many miles long, which stretched their claws out after him, and rose up like enormous rocks, from which rolling masses dashed down and became fire-spitting dragons. The prince was lying half dead in his ship when it sank at last with a terrible shock into the branches of a large tree in the wood. "I will conquer God," said the prince. "I have sworn it. My will must be done." And he spent 7 years in the construction of wonderful ships to sail through the air, and had darts cast from the hardest steel to break the balls of heaven with. He gathered warriors from all countries, so many that when they were placed side by side they covered the space of several miles. They entered the ships, and the prince was approaching his own, when God sent a swarm of gnats, one swarm of little gnats. They buzzed round the prince and stung his face and hands. Angrily he drew his sword and brandished it, but he only touched the air and did not hit the gnats. Then he ordered his servants to bring costly coverings and wrap him in them, that the gnats might no longer be able to reach him. The servants carried out his orders, but one single gnat had placed itself inside one of the coverings, crept into the prince's ear, and stung him. The place burnt like fire, and the poison entered into his blood. Mad with pain, he tore off the coverings and his clothes too, flinging them far away, and danced about before the eyes of his ferocious soldiers, who now mocked at him, the mad prince, who wished to make war with God, and was overcome by a single little gnat. The wild swains, far away in the land to which the swallows fly when it is winter, dwelt a king who had 11 sons and one daughter named Eliza. The 11 brothers were princes, and each went to school with a star on his breast and a sword by his side. They wrote with diamond pencils on gold slates, and learnt their lessons so quickly and read so easily that everyone might know they were princes. Their sister Eliza sat on a little stool of plate glass, and had a book full of pictures, which had cost as much as half a kingdom. All these children were indeed happy, but it was not to remain so always. Their father, who was king of the country, married a very wicked queen, who did not love the poor children at all. They knew this from the very first day after the wedding. In the palace there were great festivities, and the children played at receiving company, but instead of having, as usual, all the cakes and apples that were left, she gave them some sand in a teacup, and told them to pretend it was cake. The week after, she sent little Eliza into the country to a peasant and his wife, and then she told the king so many untrue things about the young princes that he gave himself no more trouble respecting them. "Go out into the world and get your own living," said the queen. "Fly like great birds who have no voice." But she could not make them ugly as she wished, for they were turned into 11 beautiful wild swans. Then, with a strange cry, they flew through the windows of the palace, over the park, to the forest beyond. It was early morning when they passed the peasant's cottage, where their sister Eliza lay asleep in her room. They hovered over the roof, twisted their long necks and flapped their wings, but no one heard them or saw them, so they were at last obliged to fly away, high up in the clouds, and over the wide world they flew till they came to a thick, dark wood, which stretched far away to the seashore. Poor little Eliza was alone in her room, playing with a green leaf, for she had no other playthings, and she pierced a hole through the leaf, and looked through it at the sun. And it was as if she saw her brother's clear eyes, and when the warm sun shone on her cheeks, she thought of all the kisses they had given her. One day passed just like another. Sometimes the winds rustled through the leaves of the rose bush and would whisper to the roses, "Who can be more beautiful than you?" But the roses would shake their heads and say, "Eliza is." And when the old woman sat at the cottage door on Sunday and read her hymn book, the wind would flutter the leaves and say to the book, "Who can be more pious than you?" And then the hymn book would answer, "Eliza." And the roses and the hymn book told the real truth. At 15 she returned home, but when the queen saw how beautiful she was, she became full of spite and hatred towards her. Willingly would she have turned her into a swan, like her brothers, but she did not dare to do so yet, because the king wished to see his daughter. Early one morning the queen went into the bathroom. It was built of marble and had soft cushions trimmed with the most beautiful tapestry. She took 3 toads with her and kissed them, and said to one, "When Eliza comes to the bath, seat yourself upon her head, that she may become as stupid as you are." Then she said to another, "Place yourself on her forehead, that she may become as ugly as you are, and that her father may not know her." "Rest on her heart," she whispered to the third, "then she will have evil inclinations and suffer in consequence." So she put the toads into the clear water, and they turned green immediately. She next called Eliza and helped her to undress and get into the bath. As Eliza dipped her head under the water, one of the toads sat on her hair, a second on her forehead, and a third on her breast, but she did not seem to notice them. And when she rose out of the water, there were 3 red poppies floating upon it. Had not the creatures been venomous or been kissed by the witch, they would have been changed into red roses. At all events, they became flowers, because they had rested on Eliza's head and on her heart. She was too good and too innocent for witchcraft to have any power over her. When the wicked queen saw this, she rubbed her face with walnut juice so that she was quite brown. Then she tangled her beautiful hair and smeared it with disgusting ointment, till it was quite impossible to recognize the beautiful Eliza. When her father saw her, he was much shocked and declared she was not his daughter. No one but the watchdog and the swallows knew her, and they were only poor animals and could say nothing. Then poor Eliza wept and thought of her 11 brothers, who were all away. Sorrowfully she stole away from the palace and walked the whole day over fields and moors till she came to the great forest. She knew not in what direction to go, but she was so unhappy, and longed so for her brothers, who had been, like herself, driven out into the world, that she was determined to seek them. She had been but a short time in the wood when night came on, and she quite lost the path. So she laid herself down on the soft moss, offered up her evening prayer, and leaned her head against the stump of a tree. All nature was still, and the soft, mild air fanned her forehead. The light of hundreds of glowworms shone amidst the grass and the moss like green fire, and if she touched a twig with her hand, ever so lightly, the brilliant insects fell down around her like shooting stars. All night long she dreamt of her brothers. She and they were children again, playing together. She saw them writing with their diamond pencils on golden slates, while she looked at the beautiful picture book which had cost half a kingdom. They were not writing lines and letters, as they used to do, but descriptions of the noble deeds they had performed and of all they had discovered and seen. In the picture book, too, everything was living. the birds sang, and the people came out of the book and spoke to Eliza and her brothers, but as the leaves turned over, they darted back again to their places, that all might be in order. When she awoke, the sun was high in the heavens, yet she could not see him, for the lofty trees spread their branches thickly over her head, but his beams were glancing through the leaves here and there like a golden mist. There was a sweet fragrance from the fresh green verdure, and the birds almost perched upon her shoulders. She heard water rippling from a number of springs, all flowing in a lake with golden sands. Bushes grew thickly round the lake, and at one spot an opening had been made by a deer, through which Eliza went down to the water. The lake was so clear that, had not the wind rustled the branches of the trees and the bushes so that they moved, they would have appeared as if painted in the depths of the lake, for every leaf was reflected in the water, whether it stood in the shade or the sunshine. As soon as Eliza saw her own face, she was quite terrified at finding it so brown and ugly, but when she wetted her little hand and rubbed her eyes and forehead, the white skin gleamed forth once more, and, after she had undressed and dipped herself in the fresh water, a more beautiful king's daughter could not be found in the wide world. As soon as she had dressed herself again and braided her long hair, she went to the bubbling spring and drank some water out of the hollow of her hand. Then she wandered far into the forest, not knowing whither she went. She thought of her brothers and felt sure that God would not forsake her. It is God who makes the wild apples grow in the wood to satisfy the hungry. And he now led her to one of these trees, which were so loaded with fruit that the boughs bent beneath the weight. Here she held her noonday repast, placed props under the boughs, and then went into the gloomiest depths of the forest. It was so still that she could hear the sound of her own footsteps, as well as the rustling of every withered leaf which she crushed under her feet. Not a bird was to be seen, not a sunbeam could penetrate through the large dark boughs of the trees. Their lofty trunks stood so close together that, when she looked before her, it seemed as if she were enclosed within trellis work. Such solitude she had never known before. The night was very dark. Not a single glowworm glittered in the moss. Sorrowfully, she laid herself down to sleep, and, after a while, it seemed to her as if the branches of the trees parted over her head, and that the mild eyes of angels looked down upon her from heaven. When she awoke in the morning, she knew not whether she had dreamt this, or if it had really been so. Then she continued her wandering, but she had not gone many steps forward when she met an old woman with berries in her basket, and she gave her a few to eat. Then Eliza asked her if she had not seen 11 princes riding through the forest. "No," replied the old woman, "but I saw yesterday 11 swans with gold crowns on their heads, swimming on the river close by." Then she led Eliza a little distance farther to a sloping bank, and at the foot of it wound a little river. The trees on its banks stretched their long, leafy branches across the water towards each other, and where the growth prevented them from meeting naturally, the roots had torn themselves away from the ground so that the branches might mingle their foliage as they hung over the water. Eliza bade the old woman farewell and walked by the flowing river till she reached the shore of the open sea, and there, before the young maiden's eyes, lay the glorious ocean, but not a sail appeared on its surface, not even a boat could be seen. How was she to go farther? She noticed how the countless pebbles on the seashore had been smoothed and rounded by the action of the water. Glass, iron, stones, everything that lay there mingled together, had taken its shape from the same power, and felt as smooth, or even smoother than her own delicate hand. "The water rolls on without weariness," she said, "till all that is hard becomes smooth. So will I be unwearied in my task." Thanks for your lessons, bright rolling waves. My heart tells me you will lead me to my dear brothers." On the foam-covered seaweeds lay 11 white swan feathers, which she gathered up and placed together. Drops of water lay upon them. Whether they were dewdrops or tears, no one could say. Lonely as it was on the seashore, she did not observe it, for the ever-moving sea showed more changes in a few hours than the most varying lake could produce during a whole year. If a black heavy cloud arose, it was as if the sea said, "I can look dark and angry too." And then the wind blew, and the waves turned to white foam as they rolled. When the wind slept and the clouds glowed with the red sunlight, then the sea looked like a rose leaf. But however quietly its white glassy surface rested, there was still a motion on the shore, as its waves rose and fell like the breast of a sleeping child. When the sun was about to set, Eliza saw 11 white swans with golden crowns on their heads flying towards the land, one behind the other, like a long white ribbon. Then Eliza went down the slope from the shore and hid herself behind the bushes. The swans alighted quite close to her and flapped their great white wings. As soon as the sun had disappeared under the water, the feathers of the swans fell off, and 11 beautiful princes, Eliza's brothers, stood near her. She uttered a loud cry, for, although they were very much changed, she knew them immediately. She sprang into their arms and called them each by name. Then, how happy the princes were at meeting their little sister again, for they recognized her, although she had grown so tall and beautiful. They laughed and they wept, and very soon understood how wickedly their mother had acted to them all. "We, brothers," said the eldest, "fly about as wild swans so long as the sun is in the sky, but as soon as it sinks behind the hills, we recover our human shape. Therefore must we always be near a resting place for our feet before sunset, for if we should be flying towards the clouds at the time we recovered our natural shape as men, we should sink deep into the sea. We do not dwell here, but in a land just as fair, that lies beyond the ocean, which we have to cross for a long distance. There is no island in our passage upon which we could pass the night, nothing but a little rock rising out of the sea, upon which we can scarcely stand with safety, even closely crowded together. If the sea is rough, the foam dashes over us, yet we thank God even for this rock. We have passed whole nights upon it, or we should never have reached our beloved fatherland, for our flight across the sea occupies 2 of the longest days in the year. We have permission to visit out home once in every year, and to remain 11 days, during which we fly across the forest to look once more at the palace where our father dwells and where we were born, and at the church where our mother lies buried. Here it seems as if the very trees and bushes were related to us. The wild horses leap over the plains as we have seen them in our childhood. The charcoal burners sing the old songs to which we have danced as children. This is our fatherland, to which we are drawn by loving ties, and here we have found you, our dear little sister. 2 days longer we can remain here, and then must we fly away to a beautiful land which is not our home. And how can we take you with us? We have neither ship nor boat." "How can I break this spell?" said their sister, and then she talked about it nearly the whole night, only slumbering for a few hours. Eliza was awakened by the rustling of the swans' wings as they soared above. Her brothers were again changed to swans, and they flew in circles wider and wider till they were far away. But one of them, the youngest swan, remained behind, and laid his head in his sister's lap, while she stroked his wings, and they remained together the whole day. Towards evening, the rest came back, and as the sun went down, they resumed their natural forms. "Tomorrow," said one, "we shall fly away, not to return again till a whole year has passed. But we cannot leave you here. Have you courage to go with us? My arm is strong enough to carry you through the wood, and will not all our wings be strong enough to fly with you over the sea?" "Yes, take me with you," said Eliza. Then they spent the whole night in weaving a net with the pliant willow and rushes. It was very large and strong. Eliza laid herself down on the net, and when the sun rose and her brothers again became wild swans, they took up the net with their beaks and flew up to the clouds with their dear sister, who still slept. The sunbeams fell on her face. Therefore one of the swans soared over her head so that his broad wings might shade her. They were far from the land when Eliza woke. She thought she must still be dreaming. It seemed so strange to her to feel herself being carried so high in the air over the sea. By her side lay a branch full of beautiful ripe berries, and a bundle of sweet roots. The youngest of her brothers had gathered them for her and placed them by her side. She smiled her thanks to him. She knew it was the same who had hovered over her to shade her with his wings. They were now so high that a large ship beneath them looked like a white seagull skimming the waves. A great cloud floating behind them appeared like a vast mountain, and upon it Eliza saw her own shadow and those of the 11 swans, looking gigantic in size. Altogether it formed a more beautiful picture than she had ever seen. But as the sun rose higher and the clouds were left behind, the shadowy picture vanished away. Onward the whole day they flew through the air like a winged arrow, yet more slowly than usual, for they had their sister to carry. The weather seemed inclined to be stormy, and Eliza watched the sinking sun with great anxiety, for the little rock in the ocean was not yet in sight. It appeared to her as if the swans were making great efforts with their wings. Alas, she was the cause of their not advancing more quickly. When the sun set, they would change to men, fall into the sea and be drowned. Then she offered a prayer from her inmost heart, but still no appearance of the rock. Dark clouds came nearer. The gusts of wind told of a coming storm, while from a thick, heavy mass of clouds the lightning burst forth flash after flash. The sun had reached the edge of the sea, when the swans darted down so swiftly that Eliza's head trembled. She believed they were falling, but they again soared onward. Presently she caught sight of the rock just below them, and by this time the sun was half hidden by the waves. The rock did not appear larger than a seal's head thrust out of the water. They sunk so rapidly that at the moment their feet touched the rock, it shone only like a star, and at last disappeared like the last spark in a piece of burnt paper. Then she saw her brothers standing closely round her with their arms linked together. There was but just room enough for them, and not the smallest space to spare. The sea dashed against the rock and covered them with spray. The heavens were lighted up with continual flashes, and peal after peal of thunder rolled. But the sister and brothers sat holding each other's hands and singing hymns from which they gained hope and courage. In the early dawn the air became calm and still, and at sunrise the swans flew away from the rock with Eliza. The sea was still rough, and from their high position in the air, the white foam on the dark green waves looked like millions of swans swimming on the water. As the sun rose higher, Eliza saw before her, floating on the air, a range of mountains with shining masses of ice on their summits. In the center rose a castle, apparently a mile long, with rows of columns rising one above another, while around it palm trees waved and flowers bloomed as large as mill wheels. She asked if this was the land to which they were hastening. The swans shook their heads, for what she beheld were the beautiful, ever-changing cloud palaces of the Fata Morgana, into which no mortal can enter. Eliza was still gazing at the scene when mountains, forests, and castles melted away, and 20 stately churches rose in their stead, with high towers and pointed Gothic windows. Eliza even fancied she could hear the tones of the organ, but it was the music of the murmuring sea which she heard. As they drew nearer to the churches, they also changed into a fleet of ships, which seemed to be sailing beneath her. But as she looked again, she found it was only a sea mist gliding over the ocean. So there continued to pass before her eyes a constant change of scene, till at last she saw the real land to which they were bound, with its blue mountains, its cedar forests, and its cities and palaces. Long before the sun went down, she sat on a rock in front of a large cave, on the floor of which the overgrown yet delicate green creeping plants looked like an embroidered carpet. "Now we shall expect to hear what you dream of tonight," said the youngest brother, as he showed his sister her bedroom. "Heaven grant that I may dream how to save you," she replied, and this thought took such hold upon her mind that she prayed earnestly to God for help, and even in her sleep she continued to pray. Then it appeared to her as if she were flying high in the air towards the cloudy palace of the Fata Morgana, and a fairy came out to meet her, radiant and beautiful in appearance, and yet very much like the old woman who had given her berries in the wood, and who had told her of the swans with golden crowns on their heads. "Your brothers can be released," said she, "if you have only courage and perseverance." True, water is softer than your own delicate hands, and yet it polishes stones into shapes. It feels no pain as your fingers would feel. It has no soul, and cannot suffer such agony and torment as you will have to endure. Do you see the stinging nettle which I hold in my hand? Quantities of the same sort grow round the cave in which you sleep, but none will be of any use to you unless they grow upon the graves in a churchyard. These you must gather even while they burn blisters on your hands. Break them to pieces with your hands and feet, and they will become flax, from which you must spin and weave 11 coats with long sleeves. If these are then thrown over the 11 swans, the spell will be broken. But remember that from the moment you commence your task until it is finished, even should it occupy years of your life, you must not speak. The first word you utter will pierce through the hearts of your brothers like a deadly dagger. Their lives hang upon your tongue. Remember all I have told you." And as she finished speaking, she touched her hand lightly with the nettle, and a pain, as of burning fire, awoke Eliza. It was broad daylight, and close by where she had been sleeping lay a nettle like the one she had seen in her dream. She fell on her knees and offered her thanks to God. Then she went forth from the cave to begin her work with her delicate hands. She groped in amongst the ugly nettles, which burnt great blisters on her hands and arms, but she determined to bear it gladly if she could only release her dear brothers. So she bruised the nettles with her bare feet and spun the flax. At sunset her brothers returned and were very much frightened when they found her dumb. They believed it to be some new sorcery of their wicked step-mother. But when they saw her hands, they understood what she was doing on their behalf, and the youngest brother wept, and where his tears fell, the pain ceased, and the burning blisters vanished. She kept to her work all night, for she could not rest till she had released her dear brothers. During the whole of the following day, while her brothers were absent, she sat in solitude, but never before had the time flown so quickly. One coat was already finished, and she had begun the second, when she heard the huntsman's horn, and was struck with fear. The sound came nearer and nearer. She heard the dogs barking, and fled with terror into the cave. She hastily bound together the nettles she had gathered into a bundle and sat upon them. Immediately a great dog came bounding towards her out of the ravine, and then another and another. They barked loudly, ran back, and then came again. In a very few minutes all the huntsmen stood before the cave. and the handsomest of them was the king of the country. He advanced towards her, for he had never seen a more beautiful maiden. "How did you come here, my sweet child?" he asked. But Eliza shook her head. She dared not speak at the cost of her brothers' lives, and she hid her hands under her apron, so that the king might not see how she must be suffering. "Come with me," he said. "Here you cannot remain. If you are as good as you are beautiful, I will dress you in silk and velvet. I will place a golden crown upon your head, and you shall dwell and rule and make your home in my richest castle." And then he lifted her on his horse. She wept and wrung her hands, but the king said, "I wish only for your happiness. A time will come when you will thank me for this." And then he galloped away over the mountains, holding her before him on this horse, and the hunters followed behind them. As the sun went down, they approached a fair royal city with churches and cupolas. On arriving at the castle, the king led her into marble halls where large fountains played, and where the walls and the ceilings were covered with rich paintings. But she had no eyes for all these glorious sights. She could only mourn and weep. Patiently, she allowed the women to array her in royal robes, to weave pearls in her hair, and draw soft gloves over her blistered fingers. As she stood before them in all her rich dress, she looked so dazzlingly beautiful that the court bowed low in her presence. Then the king declared his intention of making her his bride, but the archbishop shook his head and whispered that the fair young maiden was only a witch who had blinded the king's eyes and bewitched his heart. But the king would not listen to this. He ordered the music to sound, the daintiest dishes to be served, and the loveliest maidens to dance. Afterwards he led her through fragrant gardens and lofty halls, but not a smile appeared on her lips or sparkled in her eyes. She looked the very picture of grief. Then the king opened the door of a little chamber in which she was to sleep. It was adorned with rich green tapestry, and resembled the cave in which he had found her. On the floor lay the bundle of flax which she had spun from the nettles, and under the ceiling hung the coat she had made. These things had been brought away from the cave as curiosities by one of the huntsmen. "Here, you can dream yourself back again in the old home in the cave," said the king. "Here is the work with which you employed yourself. It will amuse you now, in the midst of all this splendor, to think of that time." When Eliza saw all these things which lay so near her heart, a smile played around her mouth, and the crimson blood rushed to her cheeks. She thought of her brothers, and their release made her so joyful that she kissed the king's hand. Then he pressed her to his heart. Very soon the joyous church bells announced the marriage feast, and that the beautiful dumb girl out of the wood was to be made the queen of the country. Then the archbishop whispered wicked words in the king's ear, but they did not sink into his heart. The marriage was still to take place, and the archbishop himself had to place the crown on the bride's head. In his wicked spite, he pressed the narrow circlet so tightly on her forehead that it caused her pain. But a heavier weight encircled her heart, sorrow for her brothers. She felt not bodily pain. Her mouth was closed. A single word would cost the lives of her brothers. But she loved the kind, handsome king, who did everything to make her happy more and more each day. She loved him with all her heart, and her eyes beamed with the love she dared not speak. Oh, if she had only been able to confide in him and tell him of her grief! But dumb she must remain till her task was finished. Therefore at night she crept away into her little chamber, which had been decked out to look like the cave, and quickly wove one coat after another. But when she began the seventh, she found she had no more flax. She knew that the nettles she wanted to use grew in the churchyard, and that she must pluck them herself. How should she get out there? "Oh, what is the pain in my fingers to the torment which my heart endures?" said she. "I must venture. I shall not be denied help from heaven." Then, with a trembling heart, as if she were about to perform a wicked deed, she crept into the garden in the broad moonlight and passed through the narrow walks and the deserted streets till she reached the churchyard. Then she saw on one of the broad tombstones a group of ghouls. These hideous creatures took off their rags as if they intended to bathe, and then clawing open the fresh graves with their long, skinny fingers, pulled out the dead bodies and ate the flesh. Eliza had to pass close by them, and they fixed their wicked glances upon her, but she prayed silently, gathered the burning nettles, and carried them home with her to the castle. One person only had seen her, and that was the Archbishop. He was awake while everybody was asleep. Now he thought his opinion was evidently correct. All was not right with the Queen. She was a witch, and had bewitched the king and all the people. Secretly he told the king what he had seen and what he feared, and as the hard words came from his tongue, the carved images of the saints shook their heads as if they would say, "It is not so. Eliza is innocent." But the Archbishop interpreted it in another way. He believed that they witnessed against her, and were shaking their heads at her wickedness. 2 large tears rolled down the king's cheeks, and he went home with doubt in his heart. And at night he pretended to sleep, but there came no real sleep to his eyes, for he saw Eliza get up every night and disappear in her own chamber. From day to day his brow became darker, and Eliza saw it and did not understand the reason. But it alarmed her and made her heart tremble for her brothers. Her hot tears glittered like pearls on the regal velvet and diamonds, while all who saw her were wishing they could be queens. In the meantime she had almost finished her task. Only 1 coat of mail was wanting, but she had no flax left and not a single nettle. Once more only, and for the last time, must she venture to the churchyard and pluck a few handfuls. She thought with terror of the solitary walk and of the horrible ghouls, but her will was firm, as well as her trust in Providence. Eliza went, and the king and the Archbishop followed her. They saw her vanish through the wicket gate into the churchyard, and when they came nearer, they saw the ghouls sitting on the tombstone, as Eliza had seen them, and the king turned away his head, for he thought she was with them, she whose head had rested on his breast that very evening. "The people must condemn her," said he, and she was very quickly condemned by everyone to suffer death by fire. Away from the gorgeous regal halls was she led to a dark, dreary cell, where the wind whistled through the iron bars. Instead of the velvet and silk dresses, they gave her the coats of mail which she had woven to cover her, and the bundle of nettles for a pillow, but nothing they could give her would have pleased her more. She continued her task with joy and prayed for help, while the street boys sang jeering songs about her, and not a soul comforted her with a kind word. Towards evening she heard at the grating the flutter of a swan's wing. It was her youngest brother. He had found his sister, and she sobbed for joy, although she knew that very likely this would be the last night she would have to live. But still she could hope, for her task was almost finished, and her brothers were come. Then the Archbishop arrived to be with her during her last hours, as he had promised the king. But she shook her head and begged him by looks and gestures not to stay, for in this night she knew she must finish her task. Otherwise all her pain and tears and sleepless nights would have been suffered in vain. The Archbishop withdrew, uttering bitter words against her. But poor Eliza knew that she was innocent, and diligently continued her work. The little mice ran about the floor, they dragged the nettles to her feet to help as well as they could, and the thrush sat outside the grating of the window and sang to her the whole night long, as sweetly as possible to keep up her spirits. It was still twilight, and at least an hour before sunrise, when the 11 brothers stood at the castle gate and demanded to be brought before the king. They were told it could not be. It was yet almost night, and as the king slept, they dared not disturb him. They threatened, they entreated. Then the guard appeared, and even the king himself, inquiring what all the noise meant. At this moment, the sun rose. The 11 brothers were seen no more, but 11 wild swans flew away over the castle. And now all the people came streaming forth from the gates of the city to see the witch burnt. An old horse drew the cart on which she sat. They had dressed her in a garment of coarse sackcloth. Her lovely hair hung loose on her shoulders. Her cheeks were deadly pale. Her lips moved silently, while her fingers still worked at the green flax. Even on the way to death, she would not give up her task. The 10 coats of mail lay at her feet. She was working hard at the 11th, while the mob jeered her and said, "See the witch, how she mutters. She has no hymn book in her hand. She sits there with her ugly sorcery. Let us tear it in 1,000 pieces." And then they pressed towards her and would have destroyed the coats of mail, but at the same moment 11 wild swans flew over her and alighted on the cart. Then they flapped their large wings, and the crowd drew on one side in alarm. "It is a sign from heaven that she is innocent," whispered many of them, but they ventured not to say it aloud. As the executioner seized her by the hand, to lift her out of the cart, she hastily threw the 11 coats of mail over the swans, and they immediately became 11 handsome princes. But the youngest had a swan's wing instead of an arm, for she had not been able to finish the last sleeve of the coat. "Now I may speak," she exclaimed. "I am innocent." Then the people, who saw what happened, bowed to her as before a saint, but she sank lifeless in her brother's arms, overcome with suspense, anguish, and pain. "Yes, she is innocent," said the eldest brother. And then he related all that had taken place, and while he spoke there rose in the air a fragrance as from millions of roses. Every piece of faggot in the pile had taken root, and threw out branches, and appeared a thick hedge, large and high, covered with roses, while above all bloomed a white and shining flower that glittered like a star. This flower the king plucked and placed in Eliza's bosom when she awoke from her swoon, with peace and happiness in her heart. And all the church bells rang of themselves, and the birds came in great troops, and a marriage procession returned to the castle, such as no king had ever before seen. The willow. "The wisp is in the town," says the Moor woman. There was a man who once knew many stories, but they had slipped away from him. So he said, the story that used to visit him of its own accord no longer came and knocked at his door. And why did it come no longer? It is true enough that for days and years the man had not thought of it, had not expected it to come and knock. And if he had expected it, it would certainly not have come, for without there was war, and within was the care and sorrow that war brings with it. The stork and the swallows came back from their long journey, for they thought of no danger, and, behold, when they arrived, the nest was burnt, the habitations of men were burnt. The hedges were all in disorder, and everything seemed gone, and the enemy's horses were stamping in the old graves. Those were hard, gloomy times, but they came to an end, and now they were past and gone. So people said, yet no story came and knocked at the door or gave any tidings of its presence. "I suppose it must be dead, or gone away with many other things," said the man. But the story never dies, and more than a whole year went by, and he longed, oh, so very much, for the story. "I wonder if the story will ever come back again and knock." And he remembered it so well in all the various forms in which it had come to him, sometimes young and charming, like spring itself, sometimes as a beautiful maiden with a wreath of thyme in her hair and a beechen branch in her hand, and with eyes that gleamed like deep woodland lakes in the bright sunshine. Sometimes it had come to him in the guise of a peddler, and had opened its box and let silver ribbon come fluttering out with verses and inscriptions of old remembrances. But it was most charming of all when it came as an old grandmother with silvery hair and such large, sensible eyes. She knew so well how to tell about the oldest times, long before the princesses spun with the golden spindles and the dragons lay outside the castles guarding them. She told with such an air of truth that black spots danced before the eyes of all who heard her, and the floor became black with human blood. Terrible to see and to hear, and yet so entertaining because such a long time had passed since it all happened. "Will it ever knock at my door again?" said the man. And he gazed at the door, so that black spots came before his eyes, and upon the floor he did not know if it was blood or morning crepe from the dark, heavy days. And as he sat thus, the thought came upon him whether the story might not have hidden itself, like the princess in the old tale. And he would now go in search of it. If he found it, it would beam in new splendor, lovelier than ever. Who knows? Perhaps it has hidden itself in the straw that balances on the margin of the well. Carefully, carefully. Perhaps it lies hidden in a certain flower, that flower in one of the great books on the bookshelf. And the man went and opened one of the newest books to gain information on this point, but there was no flower to be found. There he read about Holger Danske, and the man read that the tale had been invented and put together by a monk in France, that it was a romance, translated into Danish and printed in that language, that Holger Danske had never really lived, and consequently could never come again, as we have sung and have been so glad to believe, and William Tell was treated just like Holger Danske. These were all only myths, nothing on which we could depend, and yet it is all written in a very learned book. "Well, I shall believe what I believe," said the man. "There grows no plantain where no foot has trod." And he closed the book and put it back in its place, and went to the fresh flowers at the window. Perhaps the story might have hidden itself in the red tulips with the golden yellow edges, or in the fresh rose, or in the beaming camellia. The sunshine lay among the flowers, but no story. The flowers which had been here in the dark, troublous time had been much more beautiful, but they had been cut off one after another to be woven into wreaths and placed in coffins, and the flag had waved over them. Perhaps the story had been buried with the flowers, but then the flowers would have known of it, and the coffin would have heard it, and every little blade of grass that shot forth would have told of it. The story never dies. Perhaps it has been here once and has knocked, but who had eyes or ears for it in those times? People looked darkly, gloomily, and almost angrily at the sunshine of spring, at the twittering birds, and all the cheerful green. The tongue could not even bear the old merry, popular songs, and they were laid in the coffin with so much that our heart held dear. The story may have knocked without obtaining a hearing. There was none to bid it welcome, and so it may have gone away. I will go forth and seek it, out in the country, out in the wood, and on the open sea beach. Out in the country lies an old manor house with red walls, pointed gables, and a red flag that floats on the tower. The nightingale sings among the finely fringed beech leaves, looking at the blooming apple trees of the garden and thinking that they bear roses. Here the bees are mightily busy in the summer-time and hover round their queen with their humming song. The autumn has much to tell of the wild chase, of the leaves of the trees, and of the races of men that are passing away together. The wild swans sing at Christmas time on the open water, while in the old hall the guests by the fireside gladly listen to songs and to old legends. Down into the old part of the garden, where the great avenue of wild chestnut trees lures the wanderer to tread its shades, went the man who was in search of the story, for here the wind had once murmured something to him of Waldemar Dyer and his daughters. The dryad in the tree, who was the story mother herself, had here told him the dream of the old oak tree. Here, in the time of the ancestral mother, had stood clipped hedges, but now only ferns and stinging nettles grew there, hiding the scattered fragments of old sculptured figures. The moss is growing in their eyes, but they can see as well as ever, which was more than the man could do who was in search of the story, for he could not find that. Where could it be? The crows flew past him by hundreds across the old trees and screamed, "Kra, da, kra, da!" And he went out of the garden and over the grass plot of the yard, into the alder grove. There stood a little six-sided house, with a poultry yard and a duck yard. In the middle of the room sat the old woman who had the management of the whole, and who knew accurately about every egg that was laid, and about every chicken that could creep out of an egg. But she was not the story of which the man was in search, that she could attest with a Christian certificate of baptism and of vaccination that lay in her drawer. Without, not far from the house, is a hill covered with red thorn and broom. Here lies an old gravestone, which was brought here many years ago from the churchyard of the provincial town, a remembrance of one of the most honoured councillors of the place. His wife and his 5 daughters, all with folded hands and stiff ruffs, stand round him. One could look at them so long that it had an effect upon the thoughts, and these reacted upon the stones as if they were telling of old times. At least it had been so with the man who was in search of the story. As he came nearer, he noticed a living butterfly sitting on the forehead of the sculptured counsellor. The butterfly flapped its wings and flew a little bit farther, and then returned fatigued to sit upon the gravestone as if to point out what grew there. 4-leaved shamrocks grew there. There were 7 specimens close to each other. When fortune comes, it comes in a heap. He plucked the shamrocks and put them in his pocket. Fortune is as good as red gold, but a new charming story would be better still, thought the man, but he could not find it here. And the sun went down round and large, the meadow was covered with vapour. The Moor woman was at her brewing. It was evening. He stood alone in his room and looked out upon the sea, over the meadow, over moor and coast. The moon shone bright, a mist was over the meadow, making it look like a great lake, and, indeed, it was once so, as the legend tells. And in the moonlight the eye realizes these myths. Then the man thought of what he had been reading in the town, that William Tell and Holger Danske never really lived, but yet live in popular story, like the lake yonder, a living evidence for such myths. Yes, Holger Danske will return again. As he stood thus and thought, something beat quite strongly against the window. Was it a bird, a bat, or an owl? Those are not let in, even when they knock. The window flew open of itself, and an old woman looked in at the man. "What's your pleasure?" said he. "Who are you? You're looking in at the first-floor window. Are you standing on a ladder?" "You have a 4-leaved shamrock in your pocket," she replied. "Indeed, you have 7, and one of them is a 6-leaved one." "Who are you?" asked the man again. "The Moor woman," she replied, "the Moor woman who brews. I was at it. The bung was in the cask, but one of the little moor imps pulled it out in his mischief and flung it up into the yard, where it beat against the window. And now the beer's running out of the cask, and that won't do good to anybody." "Pray tell me some more," said the man. "Yes, wait a little," answered the Moor-woman. "I've something else to do just now." And she was gone. The man was going to shut the window when the woman already stood before him again. "Now it's done," she said, "but I shall have half the beer to brew over again tomorrow, if the weather is suitable." "Well, what have you to ask me? I've come back, for I always keep my word, and you have 7 4-leaved shamrocks in your pocket, and one of them is a 6-leaved one. That inspires respect, for that's an order that grows beside the sandy way, but that everyone does not find. What have you to ask me? Don't stand there like a ridiculous oaf, for I must go back again directly to my bung and my cask." And the man asked about the story, and inquired if the Moor-woman had met it in her journeyings. "By the big brewing vat!" exclaimed the woman. "Haven't you got stories enough? I really believe that most people have enough of them. Here are other things to take notice of, other things to examine. Even the children have gone beyond that. Give the little boy a cigar and the little girl a new crinoline. They like that much better. To listen to stories. No, indeed, there are more important things to be done here and other things to notice." "What do you mean by that?" asked the man. "And what do you know of the world? You don't see anything but frogs and will-o'-the-wisps." "Yes, beware of the will-o'-the-wisps," said the Moor-woman, "for they're out. They're let loose. That's what we must talk about. Come to me in the moor, where my presence is necessary, and I will tell you all about it. But you must make haste, and come while your 7 4-leaved shamrocks, for which one has 6 leaves, are still fresh, and the moon stands high." And the Moor-woman was gone. It struck 12 in the town, and before the last stroke had died away, the man was out in the yard, out in the garden, and stood in the meadow. The mist had vanished, and the Moor-woman stopped her brewing. "You've been a long time coming," said the Moor-woman. "Witches get forward faster than men, and I'm glad that I belong to the witch folk." "What have you to say to me now?" asked the man. "Is it anything about the story?" "Can you never get beyond asking about that?" retorted the woman. "Can you tell me anything about the poetry of the future?" resumed the man. "Don't get on your stilts," said the crone, "and I'll answer you. You think of nothing but poetry, and only ask about that story, as if she were the lady of the whole troop. She's the oldest of us all, but she takes precedence of the youngest. I know her well. I've been young too, and she's no chicken now. I was once quite a pretty elf maiden, and have danced in my time with the others in the moonlight, and have heard the nightingale, and have gone into the forest and met the story maiden, who was always to be found out there, running about. Sometimes she took up her night's lodging in a half-blown tulip, or in a field flower. Sometimes she would slip into the church and wrap herself in the mourning crape that hung down from the candles on the altar. "You are capitally well informed," said the man. "I ought at least to know as much as you," answered the Moor-woman. "Stories and poetry. Yes, they're like 2 yards of the same piece of stuff. They can go and lie down where they like, and one can brew all their prattle, and have it all the better and cheaper. You shall have it from me for nothing. I have a whole cupboard full of poetry in bottles. It makes essences, and that's the best of it, bitter and sweet herbs. I have everything that people want of poetry in bottles, so that I can put a little on my handkerchief on holidays to smell." "Why, these are wonderful things that you're telling," said the man. "You have poetry in bottles." "More than you can require," said the woman. "I suppose you know the history of the girl who trod on the loaf, so that she might not soil her shoes? That has been written and printed too." "I told that story myself," said the man. "Yes, then you must know it. And you must know also that the girl sank into the earth directly to the Moor-woman, just as old Bogey's grandmother was paying her morning visit to inspect the brewery. She saw the girl gliding down and asked to have her as a remembrance of her visit, and got her too, while I received a present that's of no use to me, a travelling druggist's shop, a whole cupboard full of poetry in bottles. Grandmother told me where the cupboard was to be placed, and there it's standing still. Just look, you've your 7 4-leaf shamrocks in your pocket, one of which is a 6-leaf one, and so you will be able to see it. And really in the midst of the moor lay something like a great knotted block of alder, and that was the old grandmother's cupboard. The Moor woman said that this was always open to her and to everyone in the land, if they only knew where the cupboard stood. It could be opened either at the front or at the back, and at every side and corner. A perfect work of art, and yet only an old alder stump in appearance. The poets of all lands, and especially those of our own country, had been arranged here. The spirit of them had been extracted, refined, criticized and renovated, and then stored up in bottles. With what may be called great aptitude, if it was not genius, the grandmother had taken, as it were, the flavour of this and of that poet, and had added a little devilry, and then corked up the bottles for use during all future times. "Pray let me see," said the man. "Yes, but there are more important things to hear," replied the Moor woman. "But now we are at the cupboard," said the man, and he looked in. "Here are bottles of all sizes. What is in this one, and what in that one yonder?" "Here is what they call May balm," replied the woman. "I have not tried it myself. But I have not yet told you the more important thing you were to hear. The will-o'-the-wisps in the town. That's of much more consequence than poetry and stories. I ought, indeed, to hold my tongue, but there must be a necessity, a fate, a something that sticks in my throat and that wants to come out. Take care, you mortals. I don't understand a word of all this," cried the man. "Be kind enough to seat yourself on that cupboard," she retorted, "but take care you don't fall through and break the bottles. You know what's inside of them. I must tell of the great event. It occurred no longer ago than the day before yesterday. It did not happen earlier. It has now 363 days to run about. I suppose you know how many days there are in a year?" And this is what the Moor woman told. "There was a great commotion yesterday out here in the marsh. There was a christening feast. A little will-o'-the-wisp was born here. In fact, 12 of them were born all together, and they have permission, if they choose to use it, to go abroad among men and to move about and command among them, just as if they were born mortals. That was a great event in the marsh, and accordingly all the will-o'-the-wisps, male and female, went dancing like little lights across the moor. There are some of them of the dog species, but those are not worth mentioning. I sat there on the cupboard and had all the 12 little newborn will-o'-the-wisps upon my lap. They shone like glowworms. They already began to hop and increased in size every moment, so that before a quarter of an hour had elapsed, each of them looked just as large as his father or his uncle. Now, it's an old established regulation and favour that when the moon stands just as it did yesterday, and the wind blows just as it blew then, it is allowed and accorded to all will-o'-the-wisps, that is, to all those who are born at that minute of time, to become mortals, and individually to exert their power for the space of 1 year. The will-o'-the-wisp may run about in the country and through the world, if it is not afraid of falling into the sea or of being blown out by a heavy storm. It can enter into a person and speak for him, and make all the movements it pleases. The will-o'-the-wisp may take whatever form he likes, of man or woman, and can act in their spirit and in their disguise in such a way that he can effect whatever he wishes to do. But he must manage, in the course of the year, to lead 365 people into a bad way, and in a grand style too, to lead them away from the right and the truth. And then he reaches the highest point. Such a will-o'-the-wisp can attain to the honor of being a runner before the devil's state coach, and then he'll wear clothes of fiery yellow, and breathe forth flames out of his throat. That's enough to make a simple will-o'-the-wisp smack his lips. But there's some danger in this, and a great deal of work for a will-o'-the-wisp who aspires to play so distinguished a part. If the eyes of the man are open to what he is, and if the man can then blow him away, it's all over with him, and he must come back into the marsh. Or if, before the year is up, the will-o'-the-wisp is seized with a longing to see his family, and so returns to it and gives the matter up, it is over with him likewise, and he can no longer burn clear, and soon becomes extinguished, and cannot be lit up again. And when the year has elapsed, and he has not led 365 people away from the truth and from all that is grand and noble, he is condemned to be imprisoned in decayed wood, and to lie glimmering there without being able to move, and that's the most terrible punishment that can be inflicted on a lively will-o'-the-wisp. Now, all this I know, and all this I told to the 12 little will-o'-the-wisps whom I had on my lap, and who seemed quite crazy with joy. I told them that the safest and most convenient course was to give up the honor and do nothing at all. But the little flames would not agree to this, and already fancied themselves clad in fiery yellow clothes, breathing flames from their throats. "Stay with us," said some of the older ones. "Carry on your sport with mortals," said the others. "The mortals are drying up our meadows. They've taken to draining. What will our successors do? We want to flame. We will flame, cried the new-born will-o'-the-wisps. And thus the affair was settled. And now a ball was given, a minute long, it could not well be shorter. The little elf maidens whirled round 3 times with the rest, that they might not appear proud, but they preferred dancing with one another. And now the sponsors' gifts were presented, and presents were thrown them. These presents flew like pebbles across the sea-water. Each of the elf maidens gave a little piece of her veil. "Take that," they said, "and then you'll know the higher dance, the most difficult turns and twists. That is to say, if you should find them necessary. You'll know the proper deportment, and then you can show yourself in the very pick of society." The night raven taught each of the young will-o'-the-wisps to say "Goo, goo, good," and to say it in the right place, and that's a great gift which brings its own reward. The owl and the stork. But they said it was not worth mentioning, and so we won't mention it. King Waldemar's wild chase was just then rushing over the moor, and when the great lords heard of the festivities that were going on, they sent a couple of handsome dogs, which hunt on the spoor of the wind, as a present, and these might carry 2 or 3 of the will-o'-the-wisps. A couple of old alpers, spirits who occupy themselves with alp-pressing, were also at the feast, and from these the young will-o'-the-wisps learned the art of slipping through every keyhole, as if the door stood open before them. These alpas offered to carry the youngsters to the town, with which they were well acquainted. They usually rode through the atmosphere on their own back hair, which is fastened into a knot, for they love a hard seat. But now they sat sideways on the wild hunting dogs, took the young will-o'-the-wisps in their laps, who wanted to go into the town to mislead and entice mortals, and whisk, away they were. Now, this is what happened last night. Today the will-o'-the-wisps are in the town, and have taken the matter in hand. But where and how? Ah, can you tell me that? Still, I've a lightning conductor in my great toe, and that will always tell me something. "Why, this is a complete story," exclaimed the man. "Yes, but it is only the beginning," replied the woman. "Can you tell me how the will-o'-the-wisps deport themselves, and how they behave?" and in what shapes they have aforetime appeared and led people into crooked paths? I believe, replied the man, that one could tell quite a romance about the will-o'-the-wisps in 12 parts, or, better still, one might make quite a popular play of them. You might write that, said the woman, but it's best let alone. Yes, that's better and more agreeable, the man replied, for then we shall escape from the newspapers and not be tied up by them, which is just as uncomfortable as for a will-o'-the-wisp to lie in decaying wood, to have to gleam and not to be able to stir. I don't care about it either way, cried the woman. Let the rest write, those who can, and those who cannot likewise. I'll grant you an old bung from my cask that will open the cupboard where poetry's kept in bottles, and you may take from that whatever may be wanting. But you, my good man, seem to have blotted your hands sufficiently with ink, and to have come to that age of satiety that you need not be running about every year for stories, especially as there are much more important things to be done. You must have understood what is going on. The will-o'-the-wisp is in town, said the man. I've heard it, and I have understood it. But what do you think I ought to do? I should be thrashed if I were to go to the people and say, Look, yonder goes a will-o'-the-wisp in his best clothes. They also go in undress, replied the woman. The will-o'-the-wisp can assume all kinds of forms and appear in every place. He goes into the church, but not for the sake of the service, and perhaps he may enter into one or other of the priests. He speaks in the Parliament, not for the benefit of the country, but only for himself. He's an artist with the colour pot, as well as in the theatre, but when he gets all the power into his own hands, then the pot's empty. I chatter and chatter, but it must come out, what's sticking in my throat, to the disadvantage of my own family. But I must now be the woman that will save a good many people. It is not done with my good will or for the sake of a medal. I do the most insane things I possibly can, and then I tell a poet about it, and thus the whole town gets to know of it directly. No, the town will not take that to heart, observed the man. That will not disturb a single person, for they will all think I'm only telling them a story if I say, The will-o'-the-wisp is in the town, says the Moor woman. Take care of yourselves. The windmill. A windmill stood upon the hill, proud to look at, and it was proud too. I am not proud at all, it said, but I am very much enlightened without and within. I have sun and moon for my outward use, and for inward use too, and into the bargain I have stearine candles, train oil and lamps, and tallow candles. I may well say that I'm enlightened. I'm a thinking being, and so well constructed that it's quite delightful. I have a good windpipe in my chest, and I have 4 wings that are placed outside my head, just beneath my hat. The birds have only 2 wings, and are obliged to carry them on their backs. I am a Dutchman by birth, that may be seen by my figure. A flying Dutchman. They are considered supernatural beings, I know, and yet I am quite natural. I have a gallery round my chest, and house-room beneath it. That's where my thoughts dwell. My strongest thought, who rules and reigns, is called by others the man in the mill. He knows what he wants, and is lord over the meal and the bran. But he has his companion too, and she calls herself Mother. She is the very heart of me. She does not run about stupidly and awkwardly, for she knows what she wants, she knows what she can do. She's as soft as a zephyr and as strong as a storm. She knows how to begin a thing carefully, and to have her own way. She is my soft temper, and the father is my hard one. They are 2, and yet 1. They each call the other my half. These 2 have some little boys, young thoughts, that can grow. The little ones keep everything in order. When, lately, in my wisdom, I let the father and the boys examine my throat and the hole in my chest to see what was going on there, for something in me was out of order, and it's well to examine oneself. The little ones made a tremendous noise. The youngest jumped up into my hat and shouted so there that it tickled me. The little thoughts may grow. I know that very well, and out in the world thoughts come too. And not only of my kind, for as far as I can see, I cannot discern anything like myself. But the wingless houses, whose throats make no noise, have thoughts too, and these come to my thoughts and make love to them, as it is called. It's wonderful enough. Yes, there are many wonderful things. Something has come over me, or into me. Something has changed in the millwork. It seems as if the one half, the father, had altered and had received a better temper and a more affectionate helpmate. So young and good, and yet the same, only more gentle and good through the course of time. What was bitter has passed away, and the whole is much more comfortable. The days go on, and the days come nearer and nearer to clearness and to joy. And then a day will come when it will be over with me, but not over altogether. I must be pulled down that I may be built up again. I shall cease, but yet shall live on, to become quite a different being, and yet remain the same. That's difficult for me to understand, however enlightened I may be with sun, moon, stearine, train oil, and tallow. My old woodwork and my old brickwork will rise again from the dust. I will hope that I may keep my old thoughts, the father in the mill, and the mother, great ones and little ones, the family, for I call them all, great and little, the company of thoughts, because I must and cannot refrain from it. And I must also remain myself, with my throat in my chest, my wings on my head, the gallery round my body, else I should not know myself, nor could the others know me and say, "There's the mill on the hill, proud to look at, and yet not proud at all." That is what the mill said. Indeed, it said much more, but that is the most important part. And the days came, and the days went, and yesterday was the last day. Then the mill caught fire. The flames rose up high, and beat out and in, and bit at the beams and planks, and ate them up. The mill fell, and nothing remained of it but a heap of ashes. The smoke drove across the scene of the conflagration, and the wind carried it away. Whatever had been alive in the mill remained, and what had been gained by it has nothing to do with this story. The miller's family. One soul, many thoughts, and yet only one, built a new, a splendid mill which answered its purpose. It was quite like the old one, and people said, "Why, yonder is the mill on the hill, proud to look at." But this mill was better arranged, more according to the time than the last, so that progress might be made. The old beams had become worm-eaten and spongy. They lay in dust and ashes. The body of the mill did not rise out of the dust as they had believed it would do. They had taken it literally, and all things are not to be taken literally. There is no doubt about it. "That was a terrible affair," said a hen, and in a quarter of the town too, where it had not taken place. "That was a terrible affair in a hen roost. I cannot sleep alone tonight. It is a good thing that many of us sit on the roost together." And then she told a story that made the feathers on the other hens bristle up and the cock's comb fall. There was no doubt about it, but we will begin at the beginning, and that is to be found in a hen roost in another part of the town. The sun was setting, and the fowls were flying on to their roost. One hen, with white feathers and short legs, used to lay her eggs according to the regulations, and was, as a hen, respectable in every way. As she was flying upon the roost, she plucked herself with her beak, and a little feather came out. "There it goes," she said. "The more I pluck, the more beautiful do I get." She said this merrily, for she was the best of the hens, and, moreover, as had been said, very respectable. With that she went to sleep. It was dark all around, and Hen sat close to Hen. But the one who sat nearest to her merry neighbour did not sleep. She had heard, and yet not heard, as we are often obliged to do in this world in order to live at peace. But she could not keep it from her neighbour on the other side any longer. "Did you hear what was said? I mention no names, but there is a hen here who intends to pluck herself in order to look well. If I were a cock, I should despise her." Just over the fowls sat the owl, with Father Owl and the little owls. The family has sharp ears, and they all heard every word that their neighbour had said. They rolled their eyes, and Mother Owl, beating her wings, said, "Don't listen to her." "But I suppose you heard what was said?" "I heard it with my own ears, and one has to hear a great deal before they fall off. There is one among the fowls who has so far forgotten what is becoming to a hen that she plucks out all her feathers and lets the cock see it." "Prenez garde aux enfants," said Father Owl. "Children should not hear such things. But I must tell our neighbour owl about it. She is such an estimable owl to talk to." And with that she flew away. "Too-hoo, too-hoo!" They both hooted into the neighbour's dovecot to the doves inside. "Have you heard? Have you heard? Too-hoo! There is a hen who has plucked out all her feathers for the sake of the cock. She will freeze to death if she is not frozen already." "Too-hoo! Where? Where?" cooed the doves. "In the neighbour's yard. I have as good as seen it myself. It is almost unbecoming to tell the story, but there is no doubt about it." "Believe every word of what we tell you," said the doves, and cooed down into their poultry yard. "There is a hen." "Nay, some say that there are two, who have plucked out all their feathers in order not to look like the others and to attract the attention of the cock. It is a dangerous game, for one can easily catch cold and die from fever, and both of these are dead already." "Wake up! Wake up!" crowed the cock, and flew upon his board. Sleep was still in his eyes, but yet he crowed out, "3 hens have died of their unfortunate love for a cock." They had plucked out all their feathers. It is a horrible story. I will not keep it to myself, but let it go farther. "Let it go farther!" shrieked the bats, and the hens clucked, and the cocks crowed, "Let it go farther! Let it go farther!" In this way the story travelled from poultry yard to poultry yard, and at last came back to the place from which it had really started. 5 hens, it now ran, have plucked out all their feathers to show which of them had grown leanest for love of the cock, and then they all pecked at each other till the blood ran down, and they fell down dead, to the derision and shame of their family, and to the great loss of their owner. The hen who had lost the loose little feather naturally did not recognize her own story, and being a respectable hen, said, "I despise those fowls, but there are more of that kind. Such things ought not to be concealed, and I will do my best to get the story into the papers, so that it becomes known throughout the land. The hens have richly deserved it, and their family too." It got into the papers. It was printed, and there is no doubt about it. One little feather may easily grow into 5 hens. 2 brothers. On one of the Danish islands, where old thingstones, the seats of justice of our forefathers, still stand in the cornfields, and huge trees rise in the forests of beech, there lies a little town whose low houses are covered with red tiles. In one of these houses, strange things were brewing over the glowing coals on the open hearth. There was a boiling going on in glasses, and a mixing and distilling, while herbs were being cut up and pounded in mortars. An elderly man looked after it all. "One must only do the right thing," he said. "Yes, the correct thing. One must find out the truth concerning every created particle and keep to that." In the room with the good housewife sat her 2 sons. They were still small, but had great thoughts. Their mother, too, had always spoken to them of right and justice, and exhorted them to keep to the truth, which, she said, was the countenance of the Lord in this world. The elder of the boys looked roguish and enterprising. He took a delight in reading of the forces of nature, of the sun and the moon. No fairy tale pleased him so much. Oh, how beautiful it must be, he thought, to go on voyages of discovery, or to find out how to imitate the wings of birds, and then to be able to fly. Yes, to find that out was the right thing. Father was right, and mother was right. Truth holds the world together. The younger brother was quieter, and buried himself entirely in his books. When he read about Jacob dressing himself in sheepskins to personify Esau, and so to usurp his brother's birthright, he would clench his little fist in anger against the deceiver. When he read of tyrants and of the injustice and wickedness of the world, tears would come into his eyes, and he was quite filled with the thought of the justice and truth which must and would triumph. One evening he was lying in bed, but the curtains were not yet drawn close, and the light streamed in upon him. He had taken his book into bed with him, for he wanted to finish reading the story of Solon. His thoughts lifted and carried him away a wonderful distance. It seemed to him as if the bed had become a ship flying along under full sail. Was he dreaming, or what was happening? It glided over the rolling waves and across the ocean of time, and to him came the voice of Solon, spoken in a strange tongue, yet intelligible to him. He heard the Danish motto, "By law the land is ruled." The genius of the human race stood in the humble room, bent down over the bed and imprinted a kiss on the boy's forehead. "Be thou strong in fame and strong in the battle of life. With truth in thy heart, fly toward the land of truth." The elder brother was not yet in bed. He was standing at the window looking out at the mist which rose from the meadows. They were not elves dancing out there, as their old nurse had told him. He knew better. They were vapours which were warmer than the air, and that is why they rose. A shooting star lit up the sky, and the boy's thoughts passed in a second from the vapours of the earth up to the shining meteor. The stars gleamed in the heavens, and it seemed as if long golden threads hung down from them to the earth. "Fly with me," sang a voice, which the boy heard in his heart. And the mighty genius of mankind, swifter than a bird and than an arrow, swifter than anything of earthly origin, carried him out into space, where the heavenly bodies are bound together by the rays that pass from star to star. Our earth revolved in the thin air, and the cities upon it seemed to lie close to each other. Through the spheres echoed the words, "What is near? What is far? When thou art lifted by the mighty genius of mind." And again the boy stood by the window, gazing out, whilst his younger brother lay in bed. Their mother called them by their names, Anders Sandal and Hans Christian. Denmark and the whole world knows them. The 2 brothers Ersted, maidens. Have you ever seen a maiden? I mean what our pavers call a maiden, a thing with which they ram down the paving stones in the roads. A maiden of this kind is made altogether of wood, broad below and girt round with iron rings. At the top she is narrow, and has a stick passed across through her waist, and this stick forms the arms of the maiden. In the shed stood 2 maidens of this kind. They had their place among shovels, hand carts, wheelbarrows, and measuring tapes, And to all this company the news had come that the maidens were no longer to be called maidens, but hand-rammers, which word was the newest and the only correct designation among the pavers, for the thing we all know from the old times by the name of the maiden. Now, there are among us human creatures certain individuals who are known as emancipated women, as, for instance, principals of institutions, dancers who stand professionally on one leg, milliners and sick nurses. And with this class of emancipated women, the two maidens in the shed associated themselves. They were maidens among the Pava folk, and determined not to give up this honourable appellation, and let themselves be miscalled rammers. Maiden is a human name, but hand-rammer is a thing, and we won't be called things. That's insulting us. My lover would be ready to give up his engagement, said the youngest, who was betrothed to a paver's hammer, and the hammer is the thing which drives great piles into the earth, like a machine, and therefore does, on a large scale, what 10 maidens effect in a similar way. He wants to marry me as a maiden, but whether he would have me were I a hand-rammer is a question, so I won't have my name changed. And I, said the elder one, would rather have both my arms broken off. But the wheelbarrow was of a different opinion, and the wheelbarrow was looked upon as of some consequence, for he considered himself a quarter of a coach, because he went about upon one wheel. I must submit to your notice, he said, that the name maiden is common enough, and not nearly so refined as hand-rammer or stamper, which latter has also been proposed, and through which you would be introduced into the category of seals. And only think of the great stamp of state which impresses the royal seal that gives effect to the laws. No, in your case I would surrender my maiden name. No? Certainly not, exclaimed the elder. I am too old for that. I presume you have never heard of what is called European necessity, observed the honest measuring tape. One must be able to adapt oneself to time and circumstances, and if there is a law that the maiden is to be called hand-rammer, why, she must be called hand-rammer. And no pouting will avail, for everything has its measure. No, if there must be a change, said the younger, I should prefer to be called Missy, for that reminds one a little of maidens. But I would rather be chopped to chips, said the elder. At last they all went to work. The maidens rode, that is, they were put in a wheelbarrow, and that was a distinction, but still they were called hand-rammers. My, they said, as they were bumped upon the pavement. My, and they were very nearly pronouncing the whole word maiden, but they broke off short and swallowed the last syllable, for after mature deliberation they considered it beneath their dignity to protest. But they always called each other maiden, and praised the good old days in which everything had been called by its right name, and those who were maidens were called maidens. And they remained as they were, for the hammer really broke off his engagement with the younger one, for nothing would suit him, but he must have a maiden for his bride.